welcome to Crime in Court. My name is Heather, and we are rewatching the 1993 Menendez brothers trial, California versus Lyle and Eric Menendez. And they are on trial in 1993 for the homicide of their parents, which they admit to doing. So the real issue at hand is, was it self defense? Did they feel threatened? Did they feel like they were in imminent danger? And someone who can really speak to this is our next expert witness for the defense, which is Dr. Ann Wolbert Burgess. Before we get started, I wanted to talk a little bit about her because she really deserves an introduction. So I randomly found something on Hulu titled Mastermind to Think Like a Killer. And it is available on Hulu and Disney Plus. If you have Disney Plus, I think, Hulu comes along with that now. So, um, that's at least that's the case for us. So I don't know if that's everyone or if it's a certain package you have to get, but our Hulu is coming through Disney Plus. All right, so regardless of that, if you have that, I recommend checking it out. It is a three-part docu-series about Dr. Ann Burgess herself. So I don't know what her testimony is going to be like, so I want to give an introduction about her. She is a pioneer in in true crime. I mean, she really, in her own right, she's like one of the first instrumental women to really make a difference in the true crime community. So she's 87 years young. She doesn't stop. She started as a nurse. So I'm going to read a little bit about her from Wikipedia. There she is from 1984. She's currently 87, like I said, and still rocking at life. All right, so Ann Burgess is an American researcher and nurse whose work has focused on developing ways to assess and treat trauma in our victims. She is a professor at Boston College School of Nursing. So Burgess, she's been a professor. She's been a nurse. She's been teaching the FBI and helping them profile violent criminals for a very long time. So she has a very distinguished career. Her early life, she was born and grew up in Newton, Massachusetts. As a young woman, she said that the only career choices were to become a nurse or a teacher. She eventually got her nursing degree at Boston University. Burgess is a doctorally prepared, board certified psychiatric clinical nurse specialist. That was a long sentence and big words, and I got them all out. Okay, good. So she pioneered assessing and treating trauma in our victims, SA victims, any victims who succumb to a traumatic event, such as R or similar. All right, so she co founded one of the first hospital based crisis counseling programs at Boston City Hospital with Boston College sociologist Linda Little Holstrom. And this is all outlined in detail, her early career and stuff. If it's very interesting, if you want to go check that out, if you have Hulu. All right, so together, she and Holstrom conducted extensive research regarding 1960s R victims in Boston. She interviewed victims and quantified their experiences. So she was a pioneer in actually trying to figure out in law enforcement. They weren't looking at why people did things and how you felt about things. So she actually, as a nurse and someone who cared about other people, she wanted to know how it made people feel and, what were the repercussions of these traumatic events. So she interviewed victims and quantified their experiences. This caught the attention of the FBI. She began to consult for John Douglas and Robert Ressler, and other FBI agents in the behavioral science unit. You might recognize these individuals as the Mindhunter guys, like the original Mindhunter people, who termed this guy is credited with coining the term serial KILLER. So she worked with these guys, the Mindhunter guys, the ones who began criminal profiling in order to find violent offenders, violent criminals, criminals like Ted Bundy, Charles Manson, Ed Kemper, to name a few. Burgess was granted access to the early cassette tapes of those individuals, and at first she questioned working with the FBI as she had four young children at home, and she knew it. So she's a mom, she's a nurse, she's a student, she's a professor, she's everything. She's a consultant, she's everything. I wonder how old was she at that age? I don't know. Okay, so Burgess was granted access to the early cassette tapes of those individuals: Ed Kemper, Ted Bundy, Charles Manson. The importance of the work that she was doing made her agree. I was feeling pressured to make the right decision. I mean, I didn't care much often about the offenders. They were KILLERS. The biggest motivation from my perspective was helping the victims. So her line of work and what she was really focused on was helping the victims heal through, psychology, through mental health, through the mental health profession. And um, law enforcement is there to catch the guys. But they realized that they could both work together and come up with this criminal profiling, and it was very effective. And she was very instrumental in that happening. So these are some of the individuals that she helped, or is credited to help catch some of these well-known individuals. So John B. Simonis, John Jubert, Brian Dugan. These were all like violent child crime offenses. And the Menendez brothers, who we know she's an expert witness, and we're going to hear from her shortly. She also helped one of the individuals that was suing Bill Cosby back in 2005. So, actually, she was the first one who began the civil lawsuits against Bill Cosby, and multiple people came forth after the Me Too movement happened for that. So, um, I think that's a good overview of who she is. Overall, Burgess was integral in the development and expansion of the FBI's behavioral science unit. Burgess published books and findings so that behavioral science could be utilized by law enforcement. Even in her late 80s, Burgess continues to teach and work on different cases. She's currently conducting a study on missing and unalived Indigenous women. She has two sons and two daughters with her husband, Alan. Oh, this was interesting. In the documentary that came out, that her husband is an aviator, and she was also trying to learn how to fly planes at this time. She wasn't very good at the landing, I think she said, but um, but yeah, so she tried to learn how to fly planes in her spare time with all that other stuff going on. She's now a grandmother, obviously, at this point in time. You would think that that might be possible. So she has a granddaughter named Alex who helps her. Alex loves data, she said, and so she does a lot of the data collecting and compiling data for certain cases and things like that. So she's doing mass um, people who shoot up schools. I don't know if you can say that word on YouTube. Mass unalivers through the use of a gun. Manifestos. They're manifestos. So that's what she's working at, or working on with her granddaughter, which I think is cool. And she has tons of awards. She's written books. She's a huge influence in true crime and pop culture today. So I give her tons of credit. This is what she looks like today. I think she's just like I watching the documentary, I'm like, she is just the cutest lady. So this is her bio on her factory directory for Boston College. I thought that the Wikipedia explained her early career a little bit better, but I thought this was interesting too. Um, Her work continues in the study of elder abuse in nursing homes, cyberstalking, and internet sex crimes. She teaches courses in, I would love to take any one of her courses. She teaches courses in victimology, forensic science, forensic mental health, case studies in forensics, and forensics science lab. So I thought that that was very interesting. I wanted to give her her due. So without any more, sorry, I can't see. I'm in the dark today 'cause I woke up with a really bad headache and I'm just starting to feel a little bit better here. So, all right. But the light's gonna be too much for me. So I am going to get us started. Please hit that like button before I forget. I always forget. Please hit the like button and let's listen to Dr. Ann Burgess, part one of the Menendez brothers trial in 1993. Interesting fact, she did not testify in trial two. Remember, trial two, after this, they missed trial. Trial two, this same judge is on the case, but he does not allow any talk or evidence of the ABUSE word. They can't use it as their defense, which is their entire defense. So I think that that alone should get them another trial. But what do I know? All right, so let's begin.
Please raise your right hand. You do solemnly swear that the testimony you may give in the cause now pending before the court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God. Please take the stand and state your name for the record.
Ann Wolbert Burgess.
Spell your full name, please.
ANNWOLBERT BURGESS.
And do you have a professional title?
Yes, I do.
And what is that?
I am a clinical specialist in psychiatric mental health nursing.
And you have a doctorate, do you not?
Yes, I do.
Degree? And what is your doctor? You're a doctor of what?
I'm a doctor of nursing science.
So you're a doctor of nursing?
Yes.
And is your particular specialty psychiatric nursing?
Yes, it is.
And how long have you been, when did you receive your doctorate?
In 1966.
And what is your current profession?
I am a professor of psychiatric mental health nursing at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
And what are your other, if there are other, professional activities?
My other professional activities, I have clinical practice.
In what?
In both child and adult persons in psychotherapy.
Okay. And what licenses do you hold in order to be a psychotherapist?
I am certified as a clinical specialist in psychiatric mental health nursing, and that is by the American Nurses Association.
And do you have any state, you need a state license for that?
Yes, I do.
And what states do you have licenses in?
I'm licensed in both Massachusetts and Pennsylvania.
And what state do you reside in?
I reside in Massachusetts.
And you teach in Pennsylvania?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Now, we were saying you have a clinical practice, and you're a professor, and you have a clinical practice as well. And what other professional activities do you regularly engage in?
I also engage in research, clinical research.
In what fields are you engaged in clinical research?
In the fields of victim trauma, child sexual abuse, child pornography, crime scene analysis.
And are there any other professional activities that you have time for?
I also belong to professional organizations. I also hold positions with government agencies.
What agencies do you hold positions with?
I am chair for a study section at National Institutes of Health, the AIDS and Related Research Study Section 6.
Okay. Now, would you tell us about your educational background?
I have a Bachelor of Science degree from Boston University, and I'm a registered nurse at that time. I have a Master of Science degree from the University of Maryland, and I have a Doctor of Nursing Science from Boston University.
And after, did you complete your education all in one block and then start your professional work, or did you intersperse it?
I pretty much completed it in one block.
And would you tell us what the early years of your professional career were? What did you do and what were you involved with?
In my early, I always held an academic position, and I've always combined my academic position with a private practice. And because I'm an academe, I do research, and I write, I publish, and I attend professional conferences and serve on professional boards.
What was your first academic appointment?
My first academic appointment was at Boston College School of Nursing in Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts.
And what was your position there?
My position there was first associate professor, and then I was promoted to professor. And I also had some administrative positions. I was chair of the community health program in nursing, and later I was chair of the graduate program.
When did this woman sleep? I mean, seriously, I'm getting tired listening to all the wonderful things she's done and comparing. And I'm just tired. My life is not as fulfilled, I guess I would say. I mean, whose is compared to this woman?
In nursing.
And what was your next academic position?
My next academic position was at Boston University, and I went there in 1980 as Director of Nursing Research.
Now, Boston University is a different institution than Boston College, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
One is BC, one is BU.
That's right.
Okay. And I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you were what at Boston University?
I was both Director of Nursing Research, and then I was Interim Dean of the School of Nursing at Boston University.
And what was your next academic either distinction or position?
In 1983, I accepted a position at the University of Pennsylvania as the Van American Professor of Psychiatric Mental Health Nursing.
And you said currently you are the head of the Psychiatric Mental Health Nursing Division at the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing?
Yes, I am chair of the division.
What do, and I take it in that you are educating, teaching people to become psychiatric nurses?
Yes, I'm responsible for that area of nursing.
Now, describe for the juries, if you would, what is it a psychiatric nurse does?
A psychiatric nurse diagnoses and treats actual and potential mental health problems. Primarily is concerned with the care of persons who have mental problems, mental disorders.
Now, that's a different kind of track, isn't it, to get to be a therapist, for example, than just becoming a psychologist and doing it that way?
Yes, it is.
What is the main distinction in the training between being someone with a bachelor's degree in nursing and a specialty in psychiatric nursing versus someone who has a bachelor's degree in psychology and just graduate degrees in psychology?
Well, in nursing, we have our own body of knowledge, and at the undergraduate level, we prepare students to be what we call general practitioners, so that they can practice in a general way in a variety of
all
settings.
nursing.
And that's all nursing. At the master's level is when we begin to specialize, and that is when a student would select a particular area. There are generally about 5 or 6 major areas in nursing. And then at the doctoral level is where the research is done, and it pretty much follows the fairly standard PhD, Doctor of Nursing Science program of studies. But the focus, of course, would be in nursing in our own field.
Now, someone with that kind of a background who obtains a doctorate in psychiatric nursing, do they have medical information, medical training that ordinary psychologists would not ordinarily have?
Yes, we have a strong biomedical background that our students must be able to master for a beginning level practice.
Now, you've indicated you've always held an academic position and you've always been involved in research. Is
Yes,
that correct?
I have.
Could you describe for the juries what your first focus of research was?
My first focus of research was when I was at Boston College, and this actually followed my joining with several other professors on campus to have an interdisciplinary seminar for our graduate students in the healthcare system. And at the close of that semester's seminar, a colleague from that seminar, a sociologist, Linda Holmstrom, approached me to talk about a research project that she wanted to undertake. And this was actually the first time that I began a course of research, and it was on the study of rape victims.
Now, what year was it that you started this research on rape victims?
It was a one-year study between 1972 and 1973.
Now, are you familiar, Dr. Burgess, with the term rape trauma syndrome?
Yes, I am.
And where did that term come from?
That was a term that Linda Holmstrom and I coined in one of our first major publications from our sample, and that was actually the title of a paper that was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry in 1974.
And has that concept, that syndrome that you and Linda Holmstrom define, become accepted throughout both the law enforcement and psychological and psychiatric community?
Sorry about that. I had to take a call real quick. So, anyways, here we go.
Yes, it has been accepted by those communities.
Law enforcement concept, that syndrome that you and Linda Holmstrom define, become accepted throughout both the law enforcement and psychological and psychiatric community?
Yes, it has been accepted by those communities.
Now, what could you describe for us the areas of your research following this first project on rape victims?
Actually, the title of a paper that was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry in 1974.
And has that concept, that syndrome that you and Linda Holmstrom define, become accepted throughout both the law enforcement and psychological and psychiatric community?
Yes, it has been accepted by those communities.
Now, what Could you describe for us the areas of your research following this first project on rape victims?
The area of research then expanded from the adult victims to child and adolescent victims of sexual victimization.
And for how many years were you engaged in research dealing with sexual victimization of children?
This was for the first 4 or 5 years, that was the primary area. It did expand into other areas, but that was the primary area.
And did you, as a consequence of your research and writing in this area, gain recognition as nationwide as an expert in child sexual abuse?
Yes, I did.
And as a result of that, were you contacted at some point by the Federal Bureau of Investigation?
Yes, I was.
And when were you contacted by the FBI?
I believe it was 1976, 77, about that time period, possibly even 75.
And what was the basis, what was the reason for the contact by the FBI? Why did they contact you?
At that particular time, the FBI Academy, that's based in Quantico, had the responsibility of training both their own agents but also law enforcement, and they had received, I guess, a mandate that they needed to train in the area of rape and sexual assault.
Train in the area of rape and sexual assault in what sense? For what purpose?
In terms of the investigative aspect, because that's their specialty, but they needed information on the victim for them to be able to develop their training materials.
They needed information about victims of rape and sexual assault?
Correct.
In order to be able to investigate those kinds of cases?
That's correct.
And were you at that time recognized as an expert in victimology?
At that time, yes. We were certainly publishing in the area. I'm not sure at that particular time because Linda Holmstrom and I were getting our publications out, and they do need a period of time in the journals to gain acceptance.
Are you now recognized as an expert in victimology?
Yes.
What is victimology?
Victimology is a study of the victim in which all aspects, as best research is able to do, brings to bear on that particular topic.
For what purpose? Why do you want to know about victims?
The victims tell an important or a very key part of any investigation if you're doing it from the investigative standpoint, and certainly from a clinical standpoint they need treatment. But from an investigation, that is your primary source very often of information, and so that is one of their first starting points in law enforcement.
And what is it that victimology, that the study of victims, is attempting to do for law enforcement? What is the kind of information you're trying to give law enforcement about victims that can aid law enforcement in their investigation of these kinds of crimes?
Well, the task of law enforcement is to find a suspect. It's suspect apprehension is what law enforcement is primarily engaged in. And once that phase is completed, then that generally starts the criminal justice system process.
Okay. But what is it about victimology that does it assist in suspect apprehension? Does it also assist in presenting the case and knowing how to deal with victims and knowing how to assess their information, that kind of thing?
Oh, yes. And what the training is how to interview, how to take information, how to get the very best that you can from a victim. And of course, that is what we would try to help them with. They need to understand the state that the victim is in at the time they see the victim and know how to perhaps reduce some stress to get information from the victim.
Is there also, based on your research and others in the field, are there also guidelines for interviewing victims in these kinds of cases so that you're not suggesting things to them, so that you're getting as accurate and credible information as you can?
Absolutely. Yes.
Are there also, based on your research and others' research, indicia that you're training law enforcement in of when people who claim to be victims of these crimes are indeed likely to be telling the truth versus perhaps not?
Yes, all of those things, yes.
And are all of those things that you have studied and researched and are considered an expert in?
Yes.
Okay, so after this contact by the FBI, did you begin an affiliation with the Federal Bureau of Investigation?
Yes, the training division at the Academy in Quantico.
And what was it that you were doing for them?
Again, she trained the FBI back in the 70s. I mean, this woman is incredible.
Well, one of the things, it was a joint venture actually in terms of helping them with what is called the data reduction. They were doing interviews with criminals that they would be interviewing and trying to amass a certain amount of information. And that's precisely what I and some colleagues began to assist them in. And so that was really the research part and consultation.
Okay, so you were interviewing what's also known as perpetrators, is that correct?
The agents were interviewing them. We were assisting them with the data analysis part.
Okay. Just to break that down, agents are interviewing perpetrators of sex crimes?
Some were sex crimes, yes,
Okay.
at the time.
I mean, with regard to your involvement in at that time, was it, and you were trying to assess the data that the agents were receiving from the perpetrators?
Well, essentially, we devised a protocol that the agents then did 2 parts of an interview. They would do their regular interview, and then they would complete the protocol based on not only the interview, but they are very thorough in their work, and they do not just, they would look at all kinds of records to corroborate all kinds of things. And so that's what we helped them with, to the protocol.
What was the purpose of the protocol? What was the type of information that was being sought from the perpetrators?
Well, we were looking for patterns and hopefully for some predictors that would then assist law enforcement in their suspect apprehension. That's always the goal, if you will, of law enforcement.
So you were trying to find similar patterns among perpetrators of these kinds of crimes to assist law enforcement in apprehending other perpetrators
Yes.
and other crimes?
Yes, well, they would take the sample that we had, and then you would look at that from a statistical standpoint to see if that had application to other crimes.
And did there appear to be patterns of behavior, patterns of perhaps even psychological makeup among sex crime offenders?
Objection irrelevant.
Overruled. You can ask that question.
Yes, that is essentially true, yes.
Now, was this the only assistance you provided to the FBI with respect to developing protocols and patterns for apprehending suspects, or were there some other areas you got involved in with them as well?
Oh, yes, we got involved with, over the past 15 years, we've been involved in a number of studies, and some of which have been funded by the Department of Justice that have looked at other things,
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the
that
last.
have looked at other aspects
Other aspects of what?
of investigative work.
So you're still involved with the FBI, is that correct?
Yes, I am.
Now, for the past 10 years, have you been involved in a particular set of studies or projects with the FBI?
Yes, I have.
And what is the
In that docuseries that I watched, which is current, it just the date is 2024, so it came out this year. I'm not exactly sure when it came out, but I know it says this year's date. So that's interesting. That well, I wanted to point out because they're like, you still work with the FBI. Well, she actually still has over a dozen active cases, as she's like still a grandma in her 80s and doing it all. Like and she's still a professor and working on multiple cases at the same time. So this woman has no quit.
what is that study called, or what is it about?
The overall study is called the Crime Classification Project, of which there are a number of parts to that.
Okay, what part have you been affiliated with?
The part that originally started was what was called the crime scene analysis, and that is part of what's called profiling process, which is
Okay, a profiling process of whom?
profiling process of a unnamed subject.
The FBI was trying to develop profiles in order to help them apprehend unknown suspects.
Profile indicators, right? Not profiles in terms of any identified person, but just characteristics, if you will, of unknown subjects.
And one of the ways they were trying to develop that was by analyzing crime scenes.
That is correct.
And what was your involvement in the crime scene analysis portion of the crime classification project?
My role was in the analysis of the information that they brought from the interviews that they had with the convicted offenders.
But that's all right. But what involvement did you have in the process of examining crime scenes in order to make determinations about potential perpetrators?
Okay. Well, one of the things was to actually look at how they examine crime scenes, the types of records, photographs, information forensics, the massive amount of information that they took, and then how they looked at that, and essentially how they thought, their process of thinking in coming to an investigative decision, if you will, about the material that they had seen.
And were you involved with the FBI agents in refining and defining the methods by which, or the ways in which they would classify crime scenes in order to work out these characteristics of potential offenders?
Yes, I was.
And was one of the areas in which the FBI was classifying crime scenes the area of homicides, where people are killed?
That is, yes, it was.
And how long has this particular project been going on?
That project began in 1980 with a funded study.
And you were involved with it then, is that correct?
I was principal investigator on that project.
And over the course of work on that project, did the FBI and those of you who were consulting with this project come up with classifications of homicides by crime scene?
Yes.
And how many different classifications of homicides by crime scene are there?
Basically three.
Excuse me, three?
Three.
And what are the three classifications?
One is the organized, one is the disorganized, and there is a third category that has been added that's called a mixed crime scene.
Now, are there 32 kinds of homicide according to the FBI guidelines?
This is one, yes. The most recent classification of homicide identifies, I think it's 32 categories within the homicide section.
Okay. And is there a category for what's known as domestic homicide?
Yes, there is.
And what does domestic homicide mean?
Domestic homicide means where there is some type of relationship between the victim and the offender. Generally must be either a significant partner or a family member.
And are there guidelines for, well, strike that, in analyzing a crime scene, are there indicia or indicators, things that under this method of crime scene analysis point to domestic homicide versus some other kind?
Yes, there are.
And I take it there are things that point to non-domestic homicide as well?
Yes.
Okay. Now, in this particular case, Dr. Burgess, were you asked to, in effect, apply these guidelines from this FBI crime classification methodology to the crime scene in this case?
Yes, I was.
And what information or objects were you asked to review in order to make that kind of analysis?
The information included all of the crime scene photographs, the forensic reports, the medical examiner's reports, the police reports, anything that pertained to information relating to the crime scene.
Did you also read the testimony of the coroner, medical examiner in this trial?
Yes, I did.
Did you read the testimony of the investigating officer, Detective Zoller?
Yes, I did.
And you said you looked at all the crime scene photographs?
Yes, I did.
Did you also look at the autopsy photographs?
Yes, I did.
And based on your review of that material, were you able to make some classifications of this crime scene?
Yes, I did.
First of all, with respect to type of homicide, were there indicators here that pointed to a particular type of the 32 types under the FBI classification system?
Yes.
And what particular type of homicide did the crime scene analysis indicate?
A domestic killing.
And why did the analysis of the crime scene indicate a domestic killing?
There was no forced entry. There was no movement. The bodies were not touched. They were left as they, what is called, the death scene was the same as the crime scene. They were not moved. There was no evidence of material being taken
You mean no
from the
theft?
house. No theft, right, no theft. Not even the doors to the house, there was no break-in there, and there appeared to be no break-in through gates.
So that tends to indicate what?
That tends to indicate that there is a known relationship, that these were not strangers.
Well, does it tend to show that it's a family member or a close relationship, or could it also show an acquaintance or a...
Well, initially you would look at all of those factors, but essentially that there was no break-in, and where the bodies were essentially certainly suggested that it was domestic rather than they had expected, had let somebody in.
Well, if they had let somebody in, they certainly weren't shot right upon that point. Is that what you're saying? That they're in an interior room of the house?
Yes, they were.
Now, in addition to making a determination in crime scene analysis of the type of homicide, I believe you started to tell us before that there are three basic classifications for the crime scene itself.
That is correct.
And you said they were, number one was disorganized,
That is correct.
and number two was organized,
That is correct.
and number three was mixed.
Right. They should
Now-
be the other way. It should be mixed, should be in the middle.
Okay, disorganized, mixed,
Mixed.
and organized. I'll do it that way. Okay, now, what is the purpose, if you will, of classifying a crime scene as either organized or disorganized?
It speaks to the amount of planning that can be determined from just looking at a crime scene.
And why would the FBI or any law enforcement agency, for example, what investigative purpose does it serve to analyze a crime scene to see if there has been planning or no planning?
Well, it's generally going to alert or tell the investigating officer where to focus their investigation, what type of person, what relationship, et cetera, to begin to look for.
And are there certain crime scenes that tell a great deal about the actual person, if not the actual identity, personality characteristics of the perpetrator?
Yes, in fact, that's essentially what the FBI describe it as, is that they try to read the personality, if you will, of what has happened in the crime scene.
Was the earliest part of this study focusing on serial sexual killings?
Yes, it was.
And was it characteristic of many of those killings that there were sort of repetitive, since they were serial killings, there's more than one, but I mean sort of ritualistic features?
Yes, there was.
So with respect to those kinds of crime scenes, can a great deal be learned from the psychology, if you will, of the perpetrator?
Oh, yes, and don't forget the other part of the study was they had done the interviews with these persons.
With people who had been convicted of such crimes?
Yes, and they talked about their crime, so it wasn't just the crime scene, but it was able to get the offenders did talk at length.
And so as a result of the study, did the FBI develop a way of looking at a crime scene to know when certain kinds of planning is going on as reflected by what they wind up with?
Yes.
Now, with respect to a disorganized crime scene, what does that say? How does that fit into the notion of planning or no planning?
Disorganization generally implies low amount of planning.
If any?
If any, correct.
And I take it an organized crime scene?
Shows very few clues, very elaborate planning, certainly to the point where there's no apprehension of a suspect.
And when you talk about planning, is it viewed from a perspective of just whether you could tell how much thinking went in, or is it viewed from the perspective of, if you will, detection?
It is from detection as a major part.
Now, would you explain just what that means? I mean,
How to the detection aspect of a suspect. This is what was looked at in terms of the study of how quickly the person was apprehended. More likely than not, on the disorganized side, that the suspect was almost immediately apprehended. And see, that's the way the statistics came in. This is by placing these into the into the crime scene patterns, and then to see how fast there was suspect apprehension.
So does but my question is, does the planning component have to do with planning to avoid detection?
Oh, yes, yes. That's the intent of the offender, to avoid detection, yes.
Okay, I mean, that's the kind of planning that they're looking at.
Yes.
It's not like planning to, inflict a particular injury or planning to leave a pink scarf under a radiator. It's planning to avoid detection that they're focused on. Is that right?
Yes.
So if you find a disorganized crime scene, then what you're finding is low or no amount of planning to avoid detection. Would that be a fair
Generally,
statement?
yes.
And in applying these guidelines and analytical methods to the crime scene here, did you reach a conclusion about what kind of crime scene this was?
Yes, I did.
And what was that?
And I will preface it that there are generally there may be indicators of both organized and disorganized, but generally in this crime scene, I saw more evidence of disorganization.
And did that indicate to you a lack of planning to avoid detection?
Yes.
Objection sustained. The answer is right.
Does it appear to be a disorganized crime scene because you cannot see any significant evidence of planning to avoid detection?
Yes.
Now, what was, under the FBI's criteria, what was disorganized about this crime scene?
Okay. Location, choice of weapon.
Give me a list and I'll ask you to do it.
Okay.
Location.
Location, choice of weapon, injuries to victims, emotionality, indicators of emotionality, where the actual injuries were.
Okay. Is there also a concept that's applied in crime scene analysis called staging or lack of staging?
Yes, there is.
Is that part of the analysis of whether it's a disorganized crime scene, or is that another type of indicator?
No, it is an indicator that is also considered staging, yes.
And did you find staging or lack of staging in your analysis of this crime scene?
Lack of staging.
And is that an indicator of disorganized crime scene?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so we've got 6 factors now. Are there any others that you determined pointing to a disorganized crime scene?
No, no.
Now, was there a factor pointing towards organized that showed some pre-thought?
Yes.
And what was the organized factor?
One organized factor was that there were no shells found
Okay.
at the crime scene.
And was there any other organized factor that you could tell just by looking at the crime
No,
scene?
that was the main factor.
Okay. Now let's talk about each of these factors of disorganization, starting with location. What is it about the location that points to disorganized or no significant evidence of planning to avoid detection?
There was one other factor on the organized, the lack of weapon, I'm sorry. Lack of weapon and no shells.
Okay, so lack of weapons left at the scene
At the
is what
scene,
you mean?
yes.
Okay, and we'll get to those as well. Let's start just with what is it about the location? What do you mean by location?
Okay, location is where actually the crime occurred.
And what is the location here?
Location here is interior of a home that's in a residential area, in a fairly residential area. In other words, there are other houses around, and it is inside.
Okay, and what appears to be lacking in plan for escaping detection about that site?
Well, one of the factors you have to also add the type of weapon that was used.
Okay.
I'd like to combine that to look at those too. The type of weapon it was known was a shotgun.
Now, you're familiar, are you not, based on your work with the FBI and how shotguns operate?
Yes.
You're familiar with other weapons as well, based on that work?
Yes, I am.
In fact, have you been to crime scenes and actually done this analysis on site?
Yes, I have.
All right. So then we have a combination then of shotguns in a residential area being used in an interior room.
Yes.
Okay. And maybe it's obvious, but what is it about that bespeaks no significant evidence of planning to avoid detection?
Okay. Well, one of the factors is that this is a very loud type of weapon to be used, and the number of shells that were fired, there was a large number of shells fired, and so that the noise certainly was a key factor.
And when you do your crime scene analysis, the initial analysis has to do solely with what the actual scene is like. Is that right?
That's right.
But does the FBI, and do you, in working with them, upgrade the analysis as more and more information comes in?
Yes, you do.
And are you aware, therefore, that in this case, both in in-court testimony and police interviews, a fairly large number of neighbors heard this?
Yes, I am aware of that.
And does that validate the initial analysis that using a shotgun in a residential neighborhood in an interior of a house is going to be heard?
Yes.
In fact, it was heard because there were neighbors that heard it, but they didn't think that it was an actual gunfire. They thought it was like fireworks or something else in the neighborhood. They didn't think it was an actual real gun.
Okay, now you didn't know anything, by the way, and you haven't been given any information, have you, about the average response time of the Beverly Hills Police Department to gunshots in their little city?
No, I don't have that information.
Did you have the information that the Beverly Hills Police Department is located less than a mile from this particular crime scene?
No, I did not know that.
Okay, now you said the third factor here pointing towards or leading to the characterization as disorganized was the injuries to the victims. And what do you mean by that?
Injuries to victim is that you look at where on the body in a gun shooting case where the injuries are, and not only where they are on the body, but the number.
And why does that tell you something about organization versus, or how does that tell you something about organization versus disorganization?
Okay, the more organized type of person who shoots is going to use the minimum amount of shots to accomplish the task.
And why is that? Why is using a minimum amount if you're more organized preferable?
Because for several reasons. One, they thought about it, they planned it out, they want to do it as fast as they can, if you will, and avoid detection, so to get out of the area fast.
Okay. And you said there was another?
It's the type, also the type of weapon that's chosen to accomplish the task.
Okay, when you talk about that a more organized, a more planned shooting would use fewer shot, you put that in terms of getting out as fast as can. Is noise obviously also a factor?
Oh yes, noise is a factor, and the location, that the site, if you will, of the shot to again accomplish the task.
So
side of the body.
In your analysis here, based on the photographs and the autopsy report and the testimony, did you determine that this was an unnecessarily large number of shots? Okay. Did you determine that the number of shots here bespoke a disorganized crime scene?
Yes.
And you said that there was also an aspect of disorganization based on evidence of emotionality in this crime scene. And could you tell us what that means?
Yes. That the term is sometimes used overkill, that there is more shots are fired than is necessary to accomplish the task. And this was the situation in this crime scene, that a large number, far more shots were fired than necessary.
So and that indicates that there is emotion involved?
Yes, that generally points to what's called a high degree of emotion.
Now, are there any indications based on any of the crime scene information as to what emotion might have been involved?
Sexual conscious speculation.
Your Honor, that's just a foundational question.
Well, we haven't made a foundation for it, such a
All right. In the analysis in these guidelines for analysis that have been developed by the FBI, are there criteria concerning where the wounds are inflicted on victims that, based on all of the research, indicate particular attitudes by the perpetrator towards the victim?
Yes.
And you indicated that one of the indicators here of disorganization was where the injuries were.
Yes.
Is that tied to the emotionality issue?
Yes.
Okay. And what has the research shown that the FBI has conducted about the location of injuries and the attitude or emotional state, if you will, of the perpetrator?
Yes, well, the research looks at, for example, if one site, one particular area is focused on, that indicates a lot of, it could be anger or rage, for example, in sexual homicide. Parts of the body are focused upon that speak to the emotion the person has towards the sexual parts.
Okay, so in one of the analysis, if it appears that a particular part of the body has been singled out, such as the sexual parts of the body in sexual crimes, that bespeaks anger towards the victim?
Right, it speaks about their focus on those particular parts. In other areas, face, oftentimes face, there's an enormous amount of injury to the face. It doesn't have to be a gunshot, but it can be other beating and so forth. So that the site of the injury, whether it be by hand or by gun, is important. It's called either depersonalization as a way to read the injury part of the victim.
Okay. Now, when you said to the face, you're talking about where most of the trauma is focused on one part.
Yes.
Okay. Now, in this particular case, what analysis did you come up with concerning where the injuries were on these two decedents?
My analysis that the injuries were random, if you will. They were to all parts of the body. There was not one area singled out.
Did you determine that there were even injuries to parts of the body that would not be debilitating? I mean, to parts of the body that made no difference with respect to either bringing about a fatal response or debilitating the victim? What conclusion, based on this analysis, could be drawn, or what could be posited, if you will, about the fact that the injuries here appeared to be random and were to all parts of the body?
Well, that would speak to a more pervasive emotion than just one emotion, such as anger or rage or what, but would speak to a wider aspect,
Such
as fear.
Now, you said that there was a concept called staging.
Yes, I did.
And you indicated you found lack of staging here. Now, what is it that you saw or learned about this crime scene that led you to that conclusion? First of all, why don't you explain for us what staging means?
Staging means that the offender has done something to the crime scene to make it look like another crime occurred, or in some way to cover up or to lead investigators into another direction.
Okay. Now, is that like affirmatively putting things or doing things to make it look like somebody unlike the offender did the crime?
Yes, things can be actually added and brought in, or things can be removed, such as in removing items, burglarizing, to make it look like that was the primary intent.
Okay. Now, you said, though, that there were no shells found here. So something, and obviously you know about shotguns, these things fly out of them, they do hit the ground, right?
Yes.
So is the removal of the shells here staging, or is that something else?
No, that wouldn't necessarily be called staging, because it is removing, it's related to the weapon and removing the weapon, but not in the sense that it's trying to make it look like another type of crime. It's quite clear what the crime was, or the killings were.
Well, it also doesn't indicate any. Strike that. You indicated one example of staging would be, for example, to make it look like the place was burglarized when in fact it was a domestic crime.
That's correct.
Or to move the bodies to make it look like there was some maybe potential for ransom or something like that when it was just a domestic crime.
That's correct.
So you didn't see any evidence of that staging?
No, I did not.
Now, you're aware of the fact, based on testimony and police reports, that there actually were 2 rifles in the house at the time of the shooting?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
Would it be considered staging if, for example, those rifles had been loaded by the shooters and placed in that family room?
That would be one indicator, or suggest one indicator, yes.
We'll take our recess until 1:30, ladies and gentlemen. We'll resume at 1:30. Please don't.
And what does that bespeak concerning any of these indicators of disorganization?
In terms of targeting or focusing in on a particular site, it shows that there was much more of a random aspect to the shooting. It was not clearly planned into one area.
Okay. Now, in analyzing a crime scene for planning purposes, do you look at it with a view to different stages, planning stages?
Yes.
And what are the different planning stages?
There are 3 planning stages. One is where you try to get what's called the pre-crime, before the crime.
Pre-crime planning?
Pre-crime planning.
Okay.
Second would be during the crime.
Okay. Now, if you talk about planning during the crime, that means taking additional action, planning additional action?
Yes, actually how it is enacted, how the crime is enacted.
Okay, so during the crime, how it's enacted bespeaks planning at that level or planning before the crime even began?
It may include both, but primarily what happens during that precise time.
Okay, and what's the third stage?
And then the third is the immediate post-crime behavior for planning.
All right, now, you have testified that there were 2 indicators of planning at some point in the fact that no shells were found, which means somebody took the time to pick them up, and the weapons were not left behind, meaning they were removed from the scene.
That's true.
Now, do those 2 facts, shells being picked up and weapons removed, do those speak to pre-crime planning, during crime planning, or post-crime planning?
They speak to post-crime planning.
Now, there is evidence in this case that is not evidence from the crime scene concerning reloading, okay?
Yes.
It's not your role here to comment on all the evidence in this case and decide whether this was or was not a planned crime, is it?
That's true.
You're here to analyze a crime scene?
Yes.
Okay. I want to ask you one hypothetical question, though, based on the number of injuries inflicted and the location of the injuries and the significance of those injuries from a mortality standpoint, as testified to by the coroner, okay?
Yes.
And I want to give you this hypothetical question. If, hypothetically, there is one reloaded shot, and it is to the left side of Mrs. Menendez's face, okay?
Yes.
In your opinion, was that more evidence of overkill?
Yes, it was.
Was that shot, based on your medical background and your reading the testimony here, necessary in any way to affect the death of Mrs. Menendez?
No, it was not necessary.
You're familiar with the coroner's testimony that she had received numerous other fatal wounds?
That is correct.
Now, is there another way of characterizing a crime scene, apart from disorganized and organized? Is there a way of characterizing it in terms of risk of detection?
Yes.
And did you make that analysis with respect to this crime scene?
Yes, I did.
And how would you characterize this crime scene with respect to risk of detection?
Characterize it as high risk of detection.
Now, you've indicated, all right, why don't you tell us what the factors are that lead you to characterize this as high risk of detection? I take it to the person who did the shooting.
Okay. Well, one of the indicators of detection would be getting evidence on one's person. And given the location, type of weapon, there was a high probability that some of the blood from the close-range firing of multiple shots would have in some way gotten on to the person or persons. The second is, of course, the location, the small area in which this crime occurred, and the noise from the multiple guns, and that it was in August at a time when doors would be open in terms of the noise being heard outside of that immediate area.
Now, in another respect, let's assume now, you can't tell when you analyze a crime scene, I take it, well, strike that. In looking at this crime scene when you analyze this crime scene, you put out of your head anything you knew about who was ultimately arrested and what the rest of the facts of the case were. Is that
Yes.
correct? And could you tell just by a pure analysis of the physical evidence of the crime scene whether there was one shooter or 2 shooters?
No.
Now, later on, of course, you know that both Eric and Lyle were arrested, and now you know, of course, that both Eric and Lyle have testified that they were the shooters in this crime scene.
Yes.
From the perspective, then, of 2 people shooting in this close space with shotguns, was there an additional element of risk, not of detection, but of another kind of risk in this crime scene?
In terms of, yes, in terms of, first of all, reloading was one issue, and the second of getting the evidence on them.
I'm talking about risk in a small space with two people shooting shotguns off.
Well, the noise certainly is going to be double the noise in terms of, and a fast, rapid, if you will, shooting. That the noise will be very loud.
How about the risk of shooting each other?
Oh, absolutely. Knowing that they're absolutely.
So does the fact that two people would be involved in shooting a large number of rounds from shotguns, loaded mainly with size 4 buckshot, in a relatively small space, bespeak careful, thoughtful planning?
No, it does not.
Now, in addition to the risk of evidence such as blood or from the actual shooting, are you familiar with, you've indicated you're familiar with shotguns, you're familiar with the forensic evidence that guns produce, are you not?
Yes, I am.
You're familiar with gunshot residue testing, for example?
Yes, I am.
And firing a large number of rounds from a shotgun, does that produce a fairly large quantity of gunshot residue?
Yes, it does.
So if there is evidence that persons fired this kind of gun and there's no evidence that they wore anything protective to keep the residue off them, does that add to the high-risk nature of this crime scene?
Yes.
Now, in picking up the shells, okay, in analyzing this crime scene, when you looked at it and realized that the shooter had, or shooters had picked up the shells, although that bespeaks some post-crime planning, does it increase risk of detection post-crime?
Yes, it does.
And in what way?
Because the evidence can be found. It depends where the evidence goes, where it is ultimately put.
So there is a transportation period, or a need then to try to dispose of something.
That's correct.
And if it's the person who did the shooting who's trying to do that, that person's running around with evidence.
That's correct.
Now, in these studies of particularly serial killers, people who have killed multiple times, where you see, I guess, the highest level of organization and planning?
That's correct, yes.
When people like that are planning crimes, do they plan for these eventualities, like you'll have to get rid of this, and you'll have to get rid of that unless you do it this way or unless you do it that way?
Yes. Yes, they do.
So is the fact that you then take evidence and leave it in a place and call the police and bring them to that place a non-planned, non-thought-out type of activity?
Yes, it is.
Now, you're aware in this case, are you not, that it was Eric and Lyle who called the police, the defendants who called the police to the scene?
I'm aware of that.
And you're aware, are you not, that prior to ever searching Eric Menendez's car, the police allowed Eric and Lyle Menendez to go to that car and they removed material from it?
I'm aware of that.
Does the need to do that bespeak pre-crime planning?
No, it does not.
Is there, strike that. With disorganized crime scenes,
Yes.
is there a pattern to the apprehension of the perpetrators?
Yes, there is.
And what is that pattern?
Irrelevant.
Sustained.
With highly disorganized crime scenes and in domestic type crimes, okay?
Yes.
Does the FBI train both their own agents and other law enforcement to look for the perpetrator right there at the scene?
Sustained.
In this case, were the shooters right there at the scene when the police came?
Yes, they were.
Are disorganized crime scene creators ordinarily caught more quickly than organized crime scene creators?
Sustained.
Isn't the whole point of this crime scene analysis to assist the police in the swift apprehension of perpetrators?
Yes, it is.
And isn't it also standard investigative practice and taught as part of this crime scene classification that the person who calls in at a scene of a domestic crime is usually the prime suspect?
Sustained.
I mean, she's an expert in this, in profiling people, so why wouldn't they be able to answer this question? It's just a question that I have. She should be able to answer stuff like this, I would think, even though, I mean, I get the objection, like it's potentially speculation, but she's an expert in this, so these are the things that she knows. The crime scene has a lot to say about the perpetrators.
Now, you're aware, are you not, Dr. Burgess, that there's evidence in this case that Eric and Lyle Menendez purchased the weapons used some days before the shooting?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
Now, is that activity any part of crime scene analysis or crime scene classification?
It may be, yes.
Does the fact that the weapons used in a disorganized crime scene were purchased days before change the analysis that the crime scene was still disorganized with respect to planning to avoid detection?
Objection made.
Rephrase the question.
Okay. Your opinion is that, in applying these FBI guidelines of analysis, that this crime scene bespeaks lack of pre-crime planning.
That is correct.
All right. Does the fact that the shotguns that were used were bought 3 days before change that?
No, it does not.
So even though they bought the shotguns a couple days before, that doesn't necessarily show that it was pre-planned in the sense that they were organized and had a clear, thought out plan to do this. I think it was as a means to protect themselves, and they had known that, the week building up. I hope we get more information about it, because the week building up to the homicides was very contentious between Jose and the boys. This is when Jose tells Eric, "You're not going away to school. I want you home here during the week. You're not going, you're not going to stay in the dorms." And this like broke him, broke Eric's spirit, because that was him thinking like, I finally get away from this guy. And then this happened. So that was one of the things. Plus, Eric told Jose about, or told Lyle about it. And Lyle obviously wants to protect his brother and was mad. He was mad about it. So that also contributed to the whole, they Jose threatened to do whatever it takes to keep the family secret. So and threatening to, that meant he was threatening their lives. And so again, I still think that, and she thinks it wasn't planned just because they bought the shotguns. It wasn't necessarily a pre-planned, this is how we're going to do it type of thing. It was still chaotic, disorganized, and done out of fear. That's what the crime scene is telling us. So it's a big distinction.
Okay, now I'm going to change the subject, if I might. After this 15-year project with the FBI, did you engage in other research?
Yes, I did.
Actually, during the same 15 years, you were doing other things as well, were you not?
Yes, I was.
And were you involved in a clinical practice as well as your teaching?
Yes, I was.
And did you, during those same years, publish articles and other writings concerning abused children, sexually molested children, victims of sexual assault?
Yes, I did.
And did that research and the clinical practice, in your clinical practice, you treat sexually abused persons, do you not?
Yes, I do.
Did that lead you to another area of research apart from this crime scene analysis and victimology?
Yes, it did.
And what area of research did that work lead you to?
The area of research led to the understanding of the brain and its functioning. And this came about because in our clinical work, my colleague Carol Hartman and I noticed how persistent symptoms were that victims had. And despite our efforts to try to extinguish some of those symptoms, we were not having a great deal of success. And so we looked for information that could help us to better understand it. If we could better understand it, that would give us some ideas of where to point our directions for treatment.
Okay, let me interrupt you for a minute so we can get some definition here of some terms you've used. You said in treating your patients in your clinical practice, these were victims of?
Yes, of crime victims or trauma victims.
Okay. When you talk about trauma victims, do sexually molested children and other abused children fit within that category of trauma victims?
Yes, they do.
Do Vietnam War veterans fit within that category of trauma victims?
Yes, they do.
Do children who have observed wars or violence in the home fit within that category of trauma victims?
Yes, they do.
Are people who are involved, not just victims of crime, but victims of accidents where they're badly hurt, can they be trauma victims?
Yes, they may be.
All right. And does your practice include people from all those categories of trauma victims?
Yes, they do.
Now, you said there were persistent symptoms. Were these symptoms related to the trauma?
Yes, they were.
And you said you couldn't reach them in therapy. What do you mean by that? What do you mean you couldn't reach these symptoms in therapy?
Using traditional therapy, which is talking therapy, psychotherapy.
You couldn't get rid of the symptoms? Is that what you mean?
Yes, I mean, we could do a lot of talking, but the intrusive thoughts and the images were still very present in the victims, the patients.
And that was my next question. What were the symptoms that were proving so resistant to therapy?
The recurring thoughts of what had happened. And it would be both the visual images that they had. It would be wherever from a sensory standpoint, they might see things, they might hear things, they may smell things. They would get a re-experiencing of the traumatic event.
And is this an area that's been
That'd be awful to live through such a traumatic event and then to constantly be reminded of it and not be able to escape it because your brain just won't shut it off. It's crazy. I mean, this stuff is fascinating to me. I hope you guys are enjoying this as much as I am.
subject to a fair amount of research, the fact that traumatized people tend to re-experience aspects of the trauma?
Yes.
Is this something that in fact began as research into what used to be called shell shock and the experience of soldiers in war?
Yes, it is.
All right, so you wanted to get more information to understand why you couldn't help these patients stop having these replays, if you will, of the trauma.
Yes.
And where did you look to get that information?
We began reviewing the information that was available in the latest brain research, the way the mind worked, if you will, the cognitive sciences, the brain research, stress response theory, and information processing theory.
Was there some basic fund of knowledge about why trauma was producing this replay effect?
Yes, there was some basic information on that.
Could you give us some of that information as, I mean, not dumbed down, but simple enough that we can get it without having to spend 3 or 4 hours listening to it, okay?
Okay.
Okay,
Yes.
if you could.
Okay. Basically, it is we identified the area where much of this processing problem occurred.
What do you mean by processing problem?
Okay. Information comes into a person's mind via neurons that are housed in the brain. They're, if you will, like little neural mappings that we have in our brains, and there are neurotransmitters that carry information from one point to another. And this is basically what comprises how people think and organize their thinking.
Okay, so information comes in and it follows some kind of little map for that kind of information?
That's right. There are various areas in the brain, if you will, that get stimulated depending on what kind of information is coming in.
Okay.
And the area that houses, if you will, the most important part of the brain for all of this is what's called the limbic system. And this limbic system is a group of brain regions. There are actually 3 very important parts of this limbic system. I can say what they are if you want.
Well, I'm going to give you the diagram in a few minutes.
Okay.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have a little bit of further discussion, the lawyers and I and the witness, so we'll give you a break here until 2:30. Don't discuss the matter among yourselves with anyone else, and we'll resume at 2:30.
Just because she doesn't know biology doesn't mean we have
All
to
right,
teach
let's
it to her.
not bicker here. There is an objection as to the foundation and as to the nature of the research and whether or not the research itself is accepted as reliable information in the medical community and the results of that research. And
So there's no jury present, and this is kind of like a way for the attorneys to parse out what this testimony is going to be and if she's qualified to give it. So
the specific conclusions that have been drawn from that are the issues here.
Well, Your Honor, with all due respect, I don't believe that people are entitled to a complete run-through of this witness's testimony. And our understanding is Kelly Fry, even if it were still the law, and I don't believe it still is, does not apply to basic medical research, which
Well,
has...
People versus Kelly is a law in the state of California, and that's, as far as I know, the rule, and Mr. Burke wants to pop up and say something otherwise here. That's
Well-
but with all due respect, you're going to have to lay a foundation.
Okay. Dr. Burgess, do you teach the
Can I
functioning...
be heard on that point? Just
Yeah.
because it may focus whatever it is the objection
Sure.
is here. The court made reference to the McDonald case at sidebar.
Yes.
And
I analogized what the offer of proof is to some extent to the type of evidence introduced in People versus McDonald, or that was not introduced in People versus McDonald that the Supreme Court said should have been.
yes, and this is a quote from People versus McDonald where the court says, we have never applied the Kelly Fry rule to expert medical testimony, even when the witness is a psychiatrist and the subject matter is as esoteric as a reconstruction of a past state of mind, or the prediction of future dangerousness, or even the diagnosis of an unusual form of mental illness not listed in the diagnostic manual of the American Psychiatric Association. And then following up on McDonald is People versus Stoll, S-T-O-L-L, which we cited to the court in another context.
Yes.
And that also indicates that medical testimony, expert opinion testimony, along the lines of psychological testimony or medical testimony is not subject to a Kelly Fry objection. So that's why I raised with prosecution what the basis for the objection is. If it's qualification, that seems to be one thing, but I don't think it's subject to a Kelly Fry objection.
Well, Kelly Fry is a standard, whether it's that standard or some other lesser standard that is applied, still there should be a foundation laid before such evidence is introduced. If there is an objection made in a timely fashion to it, the court has a discretion to conduct these hearings outside the presence of the jury and has elected to do so. We've done that with various witnesses that the prosecution has called, and we're doing it with this one. People did not object to any of these other matters that have been gone into so far by this witness, but they are objecting to this, and it is, as far as this court is concerned, a novel area of evidence, and one that the court feels is subject to a foundation, whether you label it one way or another.
you see how the world wasn't ready to hear this? The judge is saying this isn't a well-founded reliable study or something. I don't like he's not giving Dr. Burgess credit for all her amazing work and making it like psychotherapy is just I think who was it who Pam Bazanich even asked somebody like, do you know what psychobabble is? I think it's her. Um so yeah, they try to make her out to be like this crazy, this is just um psychology isn't real and type of thing, like type of mentality. And they weren't ready to hear it. I mean, this is scientifically based information, and yet the judge is like, well, I don't know. I don't know about trauma victims and the study of how they react. And I can't, it's too much for me to deal with male on male victims. That's what he's a lot of people thought that way or felt that way and felt that men couldn't be essayed, which is obviously we know the furthest thing from the truth. And oftentimes they don't talk about it. So,
What standard I use to evaluate it is not the point at this time, but the foundation should be established.
I'd like to sit down because I'm freezing, and it's warmer if you sit down. I've learned in this courtroom.
Okay, it's a new physical phenomenon. Hot air does not rise. That is
It
not
wouldn't matter if
scientifically fried test.
it wouldn't matter if it did because I'm too short to ever get to the hot air you're on.
Well, that's why it's so warm up here. All right, you may proceed.
You're too kind, too often. Dr. Burgess, do you teach the operation of the limbic system at University of Pennsylvania?
Yes, I do.
And how many? We will mark him in a minute. How long have you been teaching this particular area of medical and biological research?
Since 1986.
And how well researched is the operation of the human limbic system?
It came into the literature with Walter Buchanan back in 1929 when he described the fight-flight phenomenon.
And is the limbic system as the source of the human brain's response to fear, is that an area that has been researched for some 60-odd years?
Yes.
And is it included in medical textbooks, medical journals? Is it taught even in high schools as basic biological science?
Yes, it is.
And was the basic research in this area, does it still continue, the basic animal research in the functioning of the brain?
Yes, it does.
Now, is it possible to do basic research on human beings when it comes to brain function?
No, it is not.
So is all the research that has been conducted, basic research in the actual workings of the brain, been conducted on animals over all these years?
Primarily with animals, but I should say that there is beginning research, especially on people that have organic brain issues like Alzheimer's and so forth, to begin to apply and study. It's not necessarily going into the brain, but it certainly is trying to see the origin, if you will, of the problem so that we can do something about it.
Well, medical technology has advanced to the point in the last, say, 15 years where certain brain functions can actually be observed without having to cut somebody's head open and cut off the brain.
That's
correct?
right.
So to the extent that medical technology allows access to the brain, some of this basic research is now being done on real humans.
That's correct, yes.
But prior to that, when the fundamental research in limbic system as the source of the so-called fight, flight, or fear response had to be conducted on animals because you couldn't cut up people's heads.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Now, in your research, first of all, the research that you have been doing has to do with seeing how the limbic system functions with respect to people who have been traumatized by fear.
That is correct.
And trying to understand how the traumatization by fear impacts the limbic system.
That is correct.
And also trying to see how such people who have been traumatized by fear react to fear, if you will, in a biological sense. What happens to their brains.
That's correct.
And this research is being conducted by how many different groups that you're aware of?
There are many groups that are conducting this. Want me to list them?
Well, the ones that, besides your own research, and there are others.
Right. Bessel van der Kolk has done research. Bruce Perry has done research. A lot of the VA, Veterans Administration hospitals, are now funded to do research on their veterans.
The group of veterans who have been traumatized?
Yes, that's correct.
And basically, what is the findings of this research concerning the limbic system in traumatized people?
Well, the finding is that at least there is that area, that it is there, and probably
what is there?
That's where the fear response is. When that gets activated, what they are now looking at is what's called the recoding, the genetic recoding, that develops into explains why the ability of the person to have this flashback, to have this thought come back into their mind with what appears to be no stimulation. In other words, they're not back in a traumatizing situation, but they're still getting the re-experiencing of the flashback.
So they're beginning to understand by studying the brain that there has been some genetic recoding of the neural structure of this set of regions of the brain.
Yeah, because there is always cellular death. And so with the new cells that are part of the way our bodies operate, there is that new genetic recoding, and it recodes for a higher level of fear, is what the current research suggests.
Now, the research that's been done that actually shows regeneration of cells or new genetic makeup, that's that basic research that's still being done on animals to show that their brains recode.
That is correct.
And this research is being applied, if you will, to the behaviors of traumatized people and is explaining their behaviors based on this physiological phenomenon that has now been studied.
Yes.
Is there anything in the methodology, either of the studying of this genetic recoding, the basic research, or in the methodology of the applied research to explain the behaviors, that is anything new or different than standard medicine, standard biology, and standard psychology?
No.
Has this explanation for behavioral changes in trauma victims based on this genetic recoding of the limbic system gained acceptance in the community that treats, evaluates, diagnoses trauma victims?
Yes.
And has this research and these understandings been incorporated in the therapy and treatment of trauma victims?
Yes, it has been.
Has the understanding that there is a physiological cause for the flashbacks altered the way therapy is now being given to, say, post-traumatic stress disorder victims, Vietnam War veterans, traumatized children, that group of trauma victims?
Yes, it definitely has.
And is there extensive now publication and teaching in the new way to treat these people because of the understanding that there is a biological and physical cause to these flashbacks and not just a psychological one?
Yes.
Your Honor, I think that's an adequate foundation, but who am I? If the court...
That's what I say.
I know you do, at every opportunity, but
Okay, yeah,
there you
always get
go.
the last word, but at this point, the prosecution has a right to cross-examine.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay, then they will.
The limbic system is a group of brain regions that primarily are composed of the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, and the megalioid section.
All right, just for a moment, let's move that chart over this way and then let the jurors come in so that they can be more comfortable in the jury room. All right, go ahead.
I believe you indicated that in 1929, research began on, and was it on changes in the limbic system caused by fear or the limbic system itself?
No, it was Cannon's initial work on fight-flight phenomenon.
And was that a study that was done in relationship to the limbic system? Or was that a psychological study?
Oh, no, it was a physiological study that really began to explain behavior in the face of frightening situations.
And it was the beginning of research into the biological origins of fear and the response to fear?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I believe you've indicated that there's beginning to be research studies on a further refinement of the biology, which would be genetic recoding. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And when you say it's beginning, when did it begin, and in what phase is this research?
Okay, the research really began about in the mid-'80s when the NIH began to fund research studies in this area. So it's roughly been a good 10 years where an enormous amount of money, federal money, has gone into various labs around the country to better understand the way the brain works and to begin to help explain behavior.
You talk about the way the brain works. The money that's been funded through the NIH on the way the brain works is not just confined to the phenomena of fear, but other things such as Alzheimer's disease.
Oh, yes.
The genetic origins of disease.
Right.
perhaps.
Actually, all the human genome study, which they're really trying to identify within cells the genetic component, so that it is a wider cut of types of studies, but they're all related to brain research. It comes under the rubric of the decade of the brain is what it's called, what the funding has been for.
And so the research is beginning, and I think you said the current research suggests, I think that was your word, suggests, that brain recoding, genetic recoding goes on as a result of continued application of fear. Would that be correct?
Yeah, as the fear is experienced, then there is an overstimulated, in other words, overwhelmed, so that there is going to be now some new recoding. That is when that seems to occur. That's what the research suggests.
Okay, but by suggests, is that the same as conclusively proven?
It's a research term. I always
Okay.
say suggest.
All right, and when you use suggest as a scientist, what are you trying to suggest?
You suggest what the research is suggesting.
But it's not, is that, to me, suggestion means it's an idea, it's an inference, but it's not necessarily conclusive.
No, I wouldn't say that. I just say that tends to be the language that we use. I can pick another word.
All right.
I prefer to use more research terms.
All right. In your mind, has it been conclusively proven that exposure to fear creates genetic recoding?
That's not covered on the relevancy issue or foundation issue. That's a weighted test.
No, it has to do with the reliability of scientific evidence, which is what the court is concerned with here. Objection overruled.
Do you remember my question?
Yes, I believe, my opinion is that the research is quite substantial in this area that states that genetic recoding does occur in terms of the fear response when the person has been overwhelmed with fear.
And what is the effect of the genetic recoding when a person is then exposed to fear another time?
Yeah, what happens is the recoding has to do with survival because fear is tied into survival, that the basic instinct in a person is to survive. So that when it gets recoded, it now gets recoded in terms of a higher level. And one of the terms that is used is what's called rekindling. So that when this person who is now exposed to another fearful situation will not take as much as someone who has not been to elicit this fear. So that's why we talk about the fear level increases. The cueing in can be much more subtle than in someone who has not been exposed to such fearful situations.
Now, psychology has suspected this for a long time, correct? That repeated exposure to fear lessens the time in which a person reacts to it.
It's been in their literature, yes.
Okay, and it's now, since the mid-'80s and the decade of the brain, that people are beginning to look at the biological origins of a psychological response.
That's
Is that
correct.
fair to say?
Yeah.
Okay. Is there any way to test a particular human being who's still alive to see if the genetic recoding has occurred?
Well, you see it in their behavior. You mean, well, they're doing the PET, well,
In other words, not
Yeah.
a test like an X-ray. I mean,
well, they do the scannings. They use the PET scannings. This is the imaging that, as the technology has so improved in terms of being able to study the brain, that's really what's being used for humans, as opposed to studying, of course, in animals.
is dissecting the brain a better way to determine if there's been genetic recoding?
You're not going to object. That is not a foundational question. It's a argumentative question.
Well, in a general sense, has it ever been verified by looking at a brain of a deceased and analyzing it for this amount?
Well, they do look at brains of deceased people. For example, Alzheimer's is just one good example. Schizophrenia are another good example, where they really do go in after someone has died to try to see where in the brain, if there are any, whatever they can see.
Observable defects that might explain Alzheimer's.
Yeah, but the problem is when you have a person that's deceased, you don't have that response. You don't have the potential for the response because
You can't stimulate the brain.
You can't stimulate the brain.
Okay. I think what my question then is there a test that you could do on a human being to see if they've had genetic recoding, which would indicate to you that they have been subjected to multiple incidents of fear?
Well, one of the problems is you don't have the before, you don't have the after.
All right, so
You have a new coding, if you will.
can you say that a specific person that you're interviewing has genetic recoding?
You can certainly tell their level of fear, and this is where this has been so useful in the applied section to persons who have been traumatized, because once you get a clear understanding of what it is that originally has traumatized them, then you can begin to make the association, the link, if you will, to what in the current situation is triggering that fear reaction. Because they give an actual explanation. The whole body reacts, the heart increases, the blood, everything kind of activates for preparing the person to fight or flee.
But in terms of there are all kinds of physiological responses to fear, correct?
Yes.
You just described many of them.
Yes.
And in addition, there's the genetic recoding that occurs as the stimulus increases or persists over time.
Correct.
Correct. And do you have any way of knowing how much stimulus is necessary to trigger genetic recoding?
No, I don't. I don't personally know that right now without researching it.
All right. Is there any way that you can talk about the neurobiology of fear,
Yes.
but is there any way to apply it to a specific individual and say that this specific individual suffers from genetic recoding or has experienced genetic recoding, and that means they've been exposed to fear?
Well, we don't say it that way.
Well, is there a way to say it that's comparable to what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, what we would say is they get an alteration in their fear processing. See, this now ties in with the way information comes into the brain and gets processed. So it has to link in because humans have a factor that animals don't. They have cognition. They have a brain that can, think and talk, etc. So that is what ties in. So yes, to your question, that you can see an altered response to fear processing. They do not process fear as people who have not been exposed to that trauma do.
But the way you determine that is by just observing the human being's response to fear.
Well, one of the things that's occurring in the research is to try to get some of the chemicals. See, stress hormones are released in the brain, and it interferes with the way the information goes back and forth, so that they are beginning to look at what, blood tests is going to be one possibility to see that people have this higher level of stress hormones, brain hormones.
Has that methodology been perfected? In other words,
Yes. I mean, the pharmacology of trying to treat is where it was one of the very promising areas to now give the medications that can reduce the fear processing. So yes, there are, and these are drug trials that go on, and they're specifically looking at, for example, PTSD in a way of reducing that intrusive imagery.
and the way they're doing it is by giving certain kinds of
Unless
medicine.
this is something that's going to be introduced here, let's get on something else.
Okay, all right. So I'm going to ask the question again, and maybe is there any way you can test an individual, for instance, Eric Menendez, and say with certainty that he has had genetic recoding as a result of being exposed to fear?
There is not a blood test currently available. That's the only way you would be able to neurobiologically look at it. All right. And you have to do it at the time that they're being under stress, so that seeing someone at a current state when you're trying to look back is not necessarily. You're not necessarily going to get those stress hormones.
There are other physiological responses that you can look at to determine if someone is undergoing stress. Such as increase the things that you look for in a lie detector test, right? Things, increased heart rate, perspiration.
I don't know about.
Who knows what lie detector tests are all about?
That's right. Get on something else.
Okay. But there is presently no way to establish that a particular individual has had this genetic decoding as long as they're still alive, correct?
Well, no, you can observe their behavior. I mean, that's what we have currently, and what this does is not to explain the behavioral symptoms, so that it really adds to what we already have.
But you're looking at behavior, and you're not running a chemical test.
But that's what fear response is behavior.
All right. I have nothing further.
Anything else?
Yeah, just to clarify one thing. You've always known, I mean, I won't say always, but for a long, long time, how the body reacts to fear with respect to releasing hormones, releasing chemicals, that's all been known. That's been mapped. That's been measured, correct?
That's correct.
The more recent additional piece of knowledge to how the body reacts to fear is that the brain itself undergoes genetic changes.
That's correct.
And that's been proven in the animal studies where they have then dissected the little critters and looked at their brain and seen that they've been remapped.
Yes.
Correct? So that's just a further explanation, the biological root, therefore, of what's triggering all those hormones, all that chemical reaction, all that
I just want to say it's amazing that we were just really diving into the study of brains back in the 80s and 90s. And now, like, look at our technology and what we can accomplish with our medicine. It's kind of crazy that I feel like it hasn't been that long for research, but it has. I mean, I guess the 80s was a while ago.
behavior.
That's correct.
So that's how it's understood now.
Yes.
The behavior's still there, and it's observable.
Yes.
All right, let me ask the defense, what exactly is it that you intend to elicit from this witness in her testimony?
Pretty much what she's just been testifying to, that they understand that this is the source of the fear response in humans, that it sends out these chemicals that cause behaviors when under stress, that in people who have experienced traumatic stress in the past, the brain may react to an even lower level of stimulation than in people who have not previously experienced fear. Traumatic fear, that when the brain does react, it stimulates this chemical reaction that causes behaviors that is not hooked into the cognitive section of the brain, but is hooked into the limbic system, which is an intuitive, autonomic type of system.
And is she going to testify as an expert in regards to either defendant, that she has examined them or formed any opinions that, in fact, that they have suffered this physiological change?
No, she's going to say that, in her opinion, Eric Menendez has suffered traumatic fear in the past, particularly concerning his sexual molestation by his father, and those and he has a history of intrusive thoughts about that. But more important, he also has a history of high anxiety and hypermonitoring behavior, and that
This is all based on information that has been provided to the witness.
This is all science, Judge. All science. The study of people is still a science. The study of people's behaviors is still a science. Just because he doesn't want to believe that it's real, that psychology is real, this is ridiculous. This is why they didn't get a fair trial. This judge was not ready to hear scientific proof, apparently.
From other sources, such as anecdotes of one sort or another?
All kinds of behavioral information, not just from Eric, but from testing, from school records, all the stuff that we've heard about.
Basically, she assumed that all that has occurred, and if it did occur, it would create a certain response in an individual. Is that basically what you're saying? Well,
what she's going to say is based on his behavioral response. He's not going to say that she cannot say his brain is altered and therefore that's this response. She's going to say his behavioral responses are such that the understanding now is there may actually be a change in the brain that causes these behavioral responses. That's what the research shows, that there's actually a biological trigger. Now, there's always been a biological trigger for fear. What she's going to testify to is with traumatized people, that biological trigger may operate on a lower level. So where before, Your Honor, for example, the kind of information...
But she's not saying that is what occurred, or if it did occur at all in Eric Menendez.
Well,
she's describing in general that is what happens.
Well, that's all she's doing before both juries. We can doubt how far she can go down the path about Eric Menendez in front of his jury alone, but she's going to do that in front of both.
Okay, so what is the people's position in regards to this?
The neurobiology of fear is not relevant to this particular case because there's no way of showing that there's no way currently of showing that these defendants have in fact had this genetic recoding, which would account for them having this biological response. And as to the genetic recoding, now as to the biological response of the flight or the fight and the increased heart rate and the release of certain kinds of adrenaline, for instance. That might be pertinent because those are things that can be tested for. But in terms of, well, you can't test for this, obviously. The test is not available. There's no blood test for it. And all she can do is say, in general, this is what the research tends to show may be occurring. And there may be a change in the brain, but we don't know if there's a change in their brain. So how is it relevant?
Let me just say, this is no different than what Eris was talking about. The psychological evidence of battered and abused people indicates that they pick up on very subtle cues. They see fear where other people might not see it, and they react to it on a heightened level because of their experience. This is no different, except it explains the biological basis for it. That's all.
Are you saying this happens in all individuals, this biological change in the brain, or just in some?
No, this does happen when the individual's overwhelmed with fear.
In everybody?
Yes.
And this recoding, genetic recoding that you've described, that happens in everybody?
If it's sufficient. Now, that piece isn't quite clear, but certainly people get the fight-flight phenomenon.
Fight-flight is a phenomenon that applies to every human being and every animal on the face of the earth. Whether there's been a recoding so that someone... Okay, I just want to make it clear for you.
Yeah, I understand part of it. Okay, in light of the evidence introduced here, the court finds that the defense has met its minimal burden for a foundation for this evidence to be produced. It doesn't mean that the witness may testify in regards to what actually happened in the situation of each defendant, but she can describe in general the nature of this reaction. All right, anything else now before we proceed? All right, let's get the juries in. As I indicated, one juror needs to take a break at 3:15 to go to a medical appointment, so that's what will happen. And we're ready to proceed.
Okay. Dr. Burgess, before we get into an actual explanation and going through the diagrams of the brain and the schematic of the brain that's up there, with respect to the limbic system, has the limbic system of the brain been studied for some time as the location of
The FYI, this is now in front of the jury.
the human body's response to fear-inducing stimulus?
Yes, it has.
And is that the place where a fear stimulus comes in and where a set of reactions begin?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. And what has been known in the research? How far back is this particular research on the limbic system as the fear response locus?
The writing goes back to 1929, Walter B. Cannon.
Okay.
Who,
And what was the basic understanding from all the... There's been research in this over the years as well.
yes, there has been.
It's almost 60 years of research.
Yes.
More than 60 years. And what is the basic understanding, biological working of this part of the brain as the locus for the body's fear response? How does it work?
How does it work? First of all,
Before we do the diagram,
Okay.
if you could just give us a general idea of how it works.
okay. In the brain, there are what are called billions of neurons, and the task of these neurons is to transmit information.
Mm-hmm.
The brain also is mapped. It's what's called neural mapping, and so that they can trace how the parts of the brain interact with each other. And these neurons take the information back and forth. In the limbic system is also housed where information comes in. So it's a very, very important part of the brain where information comes in, as well as the center for alarm and protection.
Now, it's that center. Let's say a piece of fear-inducing information comes in, okay?
Yes.
I step off the curb and a truck is coming towards me.
Yes.
Right? Now, that information gets processed into the system.
Yes.
And this is also the system where my body's going to respond to that truck.
Yes.
Okay, what does my body do in response to that truck?
Okay, there are three phases. The first is what's called, as the person reacts, is the preparatory phase. And this is where the body is alerted that there is some danger. Maybe you hear that truck coming down the street. And so what starts to activate are the brain hormones, the stress hormones, that are now going to prepare the individual for the second phase, which is where the body now must make a decision as to whether it is going to fight or flee. In other words, you're going to jump back out of the street as that truck comes, or are you going to run across the street to try to get out of its way?
Okay, now before you get to fight or flight, and I'll give you a different example than a truck for that, but first of all, what are the hormones that the brain releases?
Okay. There are actually two, and it's what's called kind of biphasic, in other words, two phases. It's the noradrenergic system gets activated.
Okay.
And
the N system.
Yeah, and it has what's called, it inhibits and it activates. So this is the two phases that is now, which speaks to the fight-flight phenomenon, so that you have both of these stress hormones going, and it shows itself also in one's body, because it is preparing the body to fight so that the muscles get taut, the heart beats.
Is this what releases adrenaline?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay,
That's one of the stress hormones.
Okay,
Yes.
so one of the stress hormones releases adrenaline or activates the adrenal system to release adrenaline?
Right, and it gets activated in the brain. Even though people feel it in the rest of their body, the brain is the primary place where it gets activated. And then, because these neurons are telling the rest of the body what to do, how to prepare itself to do something.
Okay, and people usually report that there are certain physiological symptoms of terror,
Yes,
if you will.
they do.
Rapid heartbeat, for
Yes.
example. That's because of adrenaline. That's one of the things that the stress hormones release.
Yes, it's getting more blood, if you will, to the body so that it will be prepared.
Okay, adrenaline stimulates the heart to beat.
Yes.
The beating creates more blood.
That's right.
Okay. People also talk about a tingling sensation, breathing sensations. Are these things sometimes sweat breaking out on the brow,
Yes.
clamminess? Are these physiological reactions all caused by the release of these stress hormones from the center of the brain?
Yes, and it's all automatic. It's not under anybody's control. This just happens automatically.
Now, you said the first phase is the alarm bells are going off.
Yes.
And all this stuff is flowing.
Yes.
Okay. The second phase now is when the body needs to take action of some kind.
That's correct.
In talking about, and this has been called the fight-flight stage.
That's correct.
Then let's talk about it in terms of fight-flight. Let's say somebody is coming at me to attack me, fists are up and
Yes.
looks really angry. Now I've got to decide, well, my body's got to decide whether to fight him or to run.
That's right.
Okay. Now, what is going on then biologically in the second stage when I'm being faced by this attack?
Well, that's essentially when all of the hormones are spreading to tell the body to pick one of two of these decisions of what you're going to do, make a decision.
Okay. All right. And how is this decision making made? Now, I mean, is this if the body's with all these alarm bells going on, okay, is the decision to fight or flight a decision that's made in the cognitive part, or is this a decision that's being made from this automatic everything's flowing part?
Well, see, it generally is automatic because people, again, to use the other analogy, are going to jump back if they see a truck coming.
They're not gonna think
They're not
that's
even going to think. Right. They're just going to, because it's instinctual. The fear response is present in the body to protect the person from danger. So survival becomes the main goal, if you will, of why this whole system gets activated.
And these reactions, this fight-flight reaction, is instantaneous and automatic?
Yes.
Okay, and now, in this particular phase, when the body is sprung into action, either jumping back or running forward, is there another set of hormones that get released, triggered from the limbic system?
Yes, and then there's the third phase.
Okay.
And this is what's called the blunting phase. And now the hormones change to kind of blunt pains. Take, for example, a physical trauma. In other words, people can not even realize that they've had an injury, and they see the next day that their arm is black and blue. And they might even say, how did I get that? Then they will have to think back to how they got it, because the blunting, if you will, the opiate system is activated to protect the person from the pain.
Now, the body releases opiate-type hormones that act upon neurons in such a way, nerve endings, that you don't feel pain.
That's right.
Now, is that the same thing that happens, say, if you're confronted and you're stabbed and you don't feel the wound for a while?
Mm-hmm. Yes. In fact, trauma victims coming into an emergency room very often will describe that quite vividly.
Okay, so we've been through these 3 stages. The first hormones are the alert system. Then there's the second phase where the body automatically reacts, and then there's the third blunting phase.
That's right.
Now, in this blunting phase, when the opiate system is activated, are there physical symptoms of this as well?
Yes.
And what are the physical symptoms of this?
What happens here is if the danger finally passes, then what the body now is in almost an exhausted phase. And if there has been too much stimulation and activation of all of this, I mean, you can ultimately get death from such extended trauma. But essentially, in situations we've just been talking about, the person would feel kind of exhausted. There's a crisis, and all the body reacts, and then they would just feel a lot of exhaustion. And that's the way the body is going to rejuvenate itself, get itself back, if you will, reset itself. The brain's got to reset itself.
Okay. Now, with respect to those things that set off the alarms to begin with, the fear response, okay, is there a terminology for what those things are that set off a fear response?
Well, extreme danger.
Okay. Are there cues that set off a fear response?
Yeah, anything in the environment that the person feels is a threat is going to set that off.
Now, your research was not this fundamental research into how the limbic system works, because that's been a given in medical biological circles for a long time, correct?
That's correct.
Your research and other more recent research has to do with what? With tying this to what?
Well, applying this to the symptoms that we see in traumatized populations so that we can better assist and help someone who has had a traumatizing experience.
Okay. Now, has it been understood and known in psychological research for some time that people who have been traumatized, who have experienced overwhelming fear over the course of their life, tend to react differently to new threats of fear than people who have not been traumatized by fear?
Yes.
And what is the difference that has been studied from watching and knowing about the behaviors of people?
Okay. What happens when there's been an overwhelming fear and it's been repeated very often is that in the brain there is what's called a genetic recoding. And so the fear level now for that person is going to be at a different level than for someone who has not experienced whatever that fear was.
Before we get to that, let's just talk about a behavioral scan, before we get to what the brain is doing. Okay? The recent research shows that there's actually been genetic changes in the brains of overwhelmingly traumatized people.
Yes.
So their brain system will operate automatically in response to new fear cues at a much quicker level than people who have never been subjected to overwhelming fear.
Yes,
Is that what you're saying? But before we get to this new research on genetic recoding, was there observable in the behavior of people who had been traumatized, overwhelmed by fear, that they were having fear reactions?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
They were having fear reaction based on much lower levels of stimulus than my truck coming down the street?
Yes.
Okay. So a horn could honk and they'd freak out, basically.
That's right. Yes.
Okay. And you have said that you were led into this research because
Another term for this is you're hypervigilant. So everything in your environment feels scary to you. So you're like always aware of what's going on because you're afraid of your environment. You've been in a traumatic experience. You've had a traumatic event which altered your recoding, your genetic recoding, and so you're preparing yourself for more instances of fear all around you, and it sucks. It sucks to kind of live that way, but um it is part of what your brain does.
of intrusive thoughts, of flashbacks, of re-experiencing fearful events among trauma victims.
That's correct.
But was there also observed, apart from people having flashbacks or re-experiencing, was there also observed among traumatized people heightened sensitivity to cues of potential fear?
Yes. Yes.
Was there also observed anxiety levels in these people, a sort of high ongoing level of fear?
Yes.
You're familiar with the research on abused children that talks about such things as hypervigilance.
Yes, I am.
What does hypervigilance have to do with this discussion about fear and reaction to fear?
In essence, that observation is explained by this fear-altered process. In other words, something in the environment is causing that the person is constantly searching the environment for anything that may be dangerous.
And that seems to be a common characteristic of people who have been traumatized by fear-inducing behaviors?
Yes, it is.
With abused children, for example, or battered wives, for example, people who have been physically or psychologically or sexually assaulted.
Yes.
Do they develop patterns of hypervigilance, minute watching of the behaviors of the people who have assaulted them or battered them?
Yes, they do.
And do they appear as a group? to have this generalized high level of anxiety?
Yes, they do.
And has there been a great deal of research on how easily thrown into high levels of fear they are by the slightest changes or cues in the behavior of their batterers?
Yes, in that type of situation, yes.
Now, the latest research that you were talking about, this genetic recoding, okay, how does this research connect to this behavioral, psychological body of research that's existed for some time?
Okay. Well, the genetic recoding now explains why the person is at a higher level of fear and must survey their environment in this heightened way.
Is there a notion that's come from this, strike that, is it now believed that people who experience these fear-inducing traumas, that their brain actually repatterns?
Yes, it gets rewired, repatterned. Yes.
And is there a term, rekindling, that is associated with this research?
Yes, there is.
Would you explain to us what the rekindling term means?
Rekindling essentially means that as the new people have not been traumatized are at one level. People who have been traumatized, it takes much less to activate their fear response. And literally, it's a term, rekindling means that there already is a base there for the fear to be activated. And so it just takes much less or more subtle kinds of cues in the environment to activate their fear response.
I think it's 3:15, Your Honor.
All right, we do have a situation where one of the jurors has an emergency medical appointment to attend to, so we'll accommodate that and recess for the day and for the week. In the trial, we have both defendants in court with all counsel and both jury panels as well. And to everybody, good morning. We're ready to resume with the trial. We have the witness back on the witness stand. Would you state your name again for the record, please?
Ann Wolbert Burgess.
All right, I'll remind you that you're still under oath.
Yes.
And you may proceed with your direct examination.
Dr. Burgess, last Friday you had started to discuss this model, if you will, this neurobiological model to explain the fear responses of traumatized persons.
Yes.
Now, before this, the research that led to the construction of this particular model, was there a substantial amount of research and literature on the observed behaviors with respect to fear of traumatized persons?
Yes, there was.
And was there in this research common patterns of how sexually molested children, abused children, war veterans, rape victims, accident victims, and other traumatized people dealt with fear?
Yes, there was.
And would you describe for the juries what that behavioral model was?
Well, the behavioral model did describe the various symptoms that included the hyperarousal, the being on guard, the scanning of the environment, and also what's called the startle reflex, that traumatized persons would have a higher level of being startled. There were also other symptoms that were described in the behavioral literature that looked at what we call anxious symptoms, avoidance symptoms, and other kinds of symptoms.
And under this behavioral model, was there efforts to understand such things as hypervigilance, which I think involves scanning the environment for cues?
Yes.
And the anxiety, the sort of across-the-board anxiety of battered and abused women, battered and abused children?
Yes.
And when you talk about avoidance, what kinds of behaviors were demonstrating avoidance?
Avoidance behaviors would be considered some of withdrawing from activities, being depressed, all the way to even some suicide ideation, suicidal thoughts.
And those were common symptoms in this class of people?
Yes, they were identified in the literature.
Now, was there also a behavioral model for the intrusive thoughts, or what we've called flashbacks?
Yes, there.
Okay.
Yes, there was.
And what were those things considered under the behavioral model?
Under the behavioral model, the type of treatment that was generally used was talking therapy, psychotherapy, cognitive therapy. There are a wide range of models considered under psychotherapy.
What was that symptom, though, of recurrent thoughts or full-blown flashbacks with very little cueing, if you will, very little common characteristics starting the process up? What were they considered?
Well, they were considered, they were just considered recurrent thoughts, and they may also have been treated by a more behavioral type of model, where they would try to extinguish the thought. It's called thought stopping. They would encourage the person to, the minute the thought came into the mind, to put it out of the mind.
And those therapies, either the behavioral thought stopping or the talking therapy, was the purpose of talking therapy to try to give insight so the person would understand why they were reacting?
Yes, that's the purpose.
And in traditional therapy, is there an expectation that if a person has insight as to why they're behaving, they can then modify the behavior or the feelings?
Yes, that's the intent.
Now, were these talking therapies or behaviorist therapies effective with traumatized people to either stop the intrusive thoughts or to get rid of these hyperarousals, scannings, startles, anxieties? Were they working?
Well, they were not working, certainly, in a population group of traumatized persons.
And based on that, is that when you and others started looking for a biological explanation for why these things were not reachable through therapy?
Yes.
Now, you told us a little bit about this system, these regions in the brain that control a person's reactions to fear-inducing stimulus.
Yes.
There are two charts up on the board. One is a schematic, I guess, and one is a cross-section of the brain. Is that right?
That's correct.
And can you utilize those charts to try to explain to the jurors how information processing in this area, fear, operates in the brain?
Yes.
Okay.
May I?
Push.
We take this large, we call it a mid-sagittal view of the human brain. You can see that there are kind of like layers here. And the one that we're most interested in terms of a limbic system is this section that is actually colored in. You can see how it extends. It's a fairly long area, this being more of a cortical area. If we move over to this, this is now a simplified representation of the limbic system, which is this. We've now moved here. And what becomes very important in terms of the fear response are three areas within all of these structures. This is the hypothalamus, this is the hippocampus, and this is the miglioid complex. And this is very critical because this sits at the base of the brain, which is...
Dr. Burgess, if you could move into the witness box or on the other side so that the jury...
Yes, we have to remember we have the jury in the audience as well.
Okay.
That's very cumbersome.
Okay, the three brain regions that are most important in the limbic system is this is the hippocampus, this is the hypothalamus, and the miglioid section, which is very important for, they contain a bundle of nerve cells, these neurons. This is very, very important regarding the fear component.
Now, do we know through how fear information like the truck coming down the street, where that information goes in the brain?
It would, this is the base of the brain, and this would be the amyloid section, which there's a lot of nerve cells there, neurons, and it would start at this particular point, but then it activates. As those neurons start sending out their messages, it starts to activate throughout the limbic system.
Okay, if you can resume your seat. When this information activates, is that those physical responses and the release of hormones? Is that what the body does?
Yes, as it goes up to the rest of the brain, it activates the the stress hormones, brain hormones.
Now, that happens in everybody.
Yes.
And I believe you started to tell us on Friday that there are stages of this processing of fear response.
Yes.
And what is the first stage called?
Yes. The first stage is the preparatory stage.
Now, what is the biological activity going on in the preparatory stage?
That's when the first signal that there is danger in the environment comes in to the brain.
And this release of stress hormones, is that part of this stage as well?
Yes, that would alert the organism to it must do something.
Now, you say it must do something.
Yes.
Why must the organism do something?
Because the most basic instinct in any human is survival, and that is the purpose of this alarm system, is to protect the individual from harm in order to survive.
And that's why it has to do something when the truck's coming down the street?
Yes.
Okay. Now, what is the second stage?
The second stage is what the person actually does. That is the fight, flight. They take action. The body is prepared to act, and it either must act against the danger or it must retreat. It must try to flee the danger.
And that's the example you gave of either you jump back to the curb or you run across the street?
Yes.
Now, what thinking is going on as we understand it? What rational processing of options and alternatives is going on between the truck is coming down the street and I jump back on the curb?
No thinking. Automatic response.
Now, has this component of the model, the fact that there is no thinking, been studied and examined and researched and written about?
Yes.
And in what situations has it been found that there is just an automatic response?
Well, in the situations where certainly the aplasia snail studies that...
Well, you're going to have to, I know.
Oh.
Anna Marie's going to want you to spell aplasia snail.
A-P-L-Y-S-I-A.
Okay. Now, what is an aplasia snail?
It's a sea snail.
A sea snail.
Sea snail.
And why are we interested in snails?
It has very important, in the base of the brain, it has larger nerves and so forth to study. So from a research standpoint, it provides a nice viewing of these nerves for the researchers.
Okay. And how does studying the snail tell us that there is no thinking but automatic instinctive survival activity going on?
Well, they've studied the avoidant, in other words, the fleeing part of that, and they have noticed that with some stimulation of these nerve bodies, that the memory, the short-term memory, will last up to an hour. With more chronic or more prolonged, if you will, stimulation of these nerves, there is actually been noted the genetic recoding, and the way it's described in the literature is it goes from the RNA changes to the DNA, one being the transmission, one being the translation.
Okay. But I think I was asking you actually something more basic than that, okay?
Okay.
And that is, for example, hypothetically, let's say you're in an automobile and somebody cuts you off.
Yes.
Okay? Very close.
Yes.
Now, are you cognitively thinking, I better turn the steering wheel and I better hit the brake, or do you just turn the steering wheel and hit the brake?
You just automatically respond. You don't think. Hopefully you have responded in a way that avoids the danger.
Now, this has been noted in all sorts of traumatic situations, has it not, that people and animals just act?
Yes.
Okay. The snail experiment, the snail studies, those actually proved that there was automatic changes in the genetic structure as a result of trauma.
Yes, the research suggested that, yes.
So it supports the biological notion that these activities are automatic and not. Let me ask you this. What is the difference in the function? What is the main function, for example, of the cortical area or the cerebral cortex, that bigger part that's on top of the limbic system?
Right, that's our thinking. That's where cognitions or thoughts or the whole way we organize our thinking is based or housed.
And did these experiments on the snails indicate that in response to prolonged stress, signals don't even get into that cognitive part?
Well, in snails, we don't have any evidence that they think.
Cognitive. But there were other
So-
experiments with other animals
Yes.
that have shown.
Well, right, yes. Well, the importance of these lower level animals and snails, et cetera, is that we do share in our survival brain these structures. So that is what becomes very important in that type of research on the basic, what's called universal instinct of survival.
You say we have a survival brain. Humans still have a survival brain?
Yes, we actually have 3 levels to brain. This has been well documented in the literature by Paul MacLean, whose research describes what he calls the triune brain in evolution.
The what brain?
Triune, Triune, triune brain in evolution.
Is that like 3-level brain? Is that what that means?
Yes.
And so even though we've evolved, we still have that original survival brain?
Yes.
Like the snail?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, are there in fact efforts made with people who have to work under traumatic conditions to take advantage of this notion of automatic response?
Yes.
And would you describe what those efforts are, who these populations of people are?
Okay. Well, persons that work under high stress need to be prepared to be able to automatically respond, and those would include such populations as soldiers going into combat. It would be, we see this and train in terms of nurses in the emergency department, to be able to automatically respond when a very stressful situation occurs.
In other words, so that they don't fight or flee, but do what they have to do.
Yes.
So this is an effort to actually override what the automatic response would be, to train them to do what's logically and reasonably necessary for their work.
Yes, you want them to be able to think clearly, stay calm, be able to attend to the task at hand.
And I take it that's not something that people who are in this fear response are able to do.
That is correct.
Now, what is it that the research shows happens to people who have been severely traumatized, whether in one big event or repeatedly, that makes them and their reaction different than the ordinary model?
What is important in traumatized populations is they begin to read the cues differently. This is what we call the rewiring, and they will read more danger into cues than necessarily a non-traumatized population.
Now, you've talked about, and others have talked about hypervigilance before. Let me give you a hypothetical. If you have a person, let's just for the sake of this hypothetical, assume it's a battered wife, okay, who knows that on Friday nights when her husband comes home from the bar, if they didn't have his favorite beer, he's going to beat her up. Okay, let's take that as a hypo. And the husband comes home with the bar and says they didn't have Miller. Okay.
Yes.
Hypothetically, she could start to experience a severe fear reaction because she has this special knowledge of what they didn't have Miller means.
Yes.
Now, if she then becomes very fearful, very frightened, she's
That's a really good example, by the way.
not wrong, is she, to be fearful then?
No, she has this knowledge of her husband.
Okay, so when we're talking about traumatized populations reading cues differently, they're not necessarily being irrational to be afraid.
No.
Okay, but what has been learned now about what the brain does with people who have been, I guess, overly frightened or repeatedly frightened?
Yes.
Okay, what is it that we've learned is happening?
Well, what we've learned is that they stay in a very high arousal state. They are very anxious, maybe very frightened. They also have this ability to scan, are constantly scanning the environment to see if there's danger. And they also can be very startled very easily because of their reading of cues in the environment.
Okay. And the research then into the brain structure has shown what?
Well, the research has shown that as you increase and especially chronic fear or continued fear, that this is the explanation for the recoding, the genetic recoding or the rewiring or whatever term. They are now going to react quite differently, and there is a neurobiological basis to what has been observed
So
behaviorally.
they actually have different cells than they had before, or different contents to those cells that keep them on this level of anxiety and arousal?
Well, the coding is different. It's the message that is sent. Our neurons send us messages, and that's what goes back and forth in the brain.
So it sends higher level of arousal messages,
Yes.
and is there reason to believe that even the general anxiety state is because they're constantly sending a message, a fear message of some sort?
Yes, they may keep the person at this very high level of anxiety.
Now, was there something that was understood by the term trauma learning that this now also gives a biological underpinning to?
Yes, the term trauma learning is a term that's been coined, actually by Dr. Carol Hartman, in terms of this phenomenon, because all of this activity is in the service of learning in the brain.
What is the brain learning through this activity?
Well, as the brain experiences, it sends these messages, so that is one of the bases for learning.
In other words, learning how to deal with fearful situations?
Yes.
Now, is there also an understanding of what happens to traumatized people who can neither fight nor flee?
Yes.
And what are the circumstances where that occurs?
Well, what happens when somebody is in such a situation, they go into this third phase, which is really the numbing phase, and they stay quite numb, if you will, to ongoing activity.
Can you give us examples of populations or people who are in situations where they can neither fight nor flee?
Yes, children certainly are a good example of populations because they don't have the equipment, if you will, to be able to fight or flee. Persons that are trapped in some type of like a hostage type of situation, they can't get out. Concentration camp persons. Even natural disasters, I suppose you could have people that are unable to get out of a hurricane or something like that.
Well, let's focus for the moment on children. Children in what kinds of situations have been, strike, all that. The study of children in situations where they can't fight or flee, okay?
Yes.
Specifically, what circumstances have you researched and studied?
I've studied children who have been abused, who have either been directly abused or have also witnessed abusing situations, violence within the home or examples such as that.
For the moment, let's take as an example a child who's being sexually molested.
Yes.
Okay? Is that, generally speaking, a traumatic incident to a child?
Yes, it is.
And how does the fight-flight mechanism work or fail to work for children in that kind of traumatic situation?
Generally, children are unable to extricate themselves or to get out of the situation, and they stay in it, both because for many reasons.
Okay. With respect to the body, okay, you've indicated there's this preparatory stage, these hormones get released. Now you're supposed to take action.
Yes.
And you're talking about people who can't take action for whatever reason.
That's right.
So do the hormones just go away? Does some little message go off and say, oh, we can't take action, we'll all go home?
No.
What happens?
The mind takes over. For example, in the flight part, one of the things that can happen is that the mind literally puts itself into another topic, and that's something that's called daydreaming, or technical term is dissociation. But they put their mind elsewhere so that they do not have to attend to what actually is occurring to them.
And that they do that during the offensive acts themselves?
Yes, they do.
And does that make the stress hormones go away, or are they still pumping?
No, the stress hormones are still pumping.
Now, is there something that's been observed, therefore, with people who get trapped in situations where they can't fight or flee, based on the fact that the stress hormones keep pumping?
Well, when those hormones keep pumping, they are influencing, certainly, the brain structure. So that is what's called the overriding component to the alarm system.
What do you mean by an overriding component?
When there is too much activity in the brain hormones and the person cannot extricate themselves from the situation, that is what generally moves the person into either the dissociation, the thinking of other things, or the numbing, is in the service of survival.
You said an overriding component. Is this also, I think you've referred to it before, as overwhelming?
Yes, overwhelming, yes.
And in your neurobiological model, is it therefore at least believed, that children who have been exposed to these situations, who have these overwhelming stress reaction and dissociate or numb, does that leave them with these symptoms we've talked about, this high anxiety, high arousal?
Yes.
Do they remain in a state of overstimulation, basically?
Well, they can't stay in a total state of overwhelm. That's just not the way the body operates in any type of situation. So there is what's called some coping, a way of managing it, or actually an adaptation to the abuse.
Why do they remain? Why doesn't it all just go away after each episode, though, and then they are back to square one like anybody else?
Well, the resetting phenomenon doesn't occur because they're still in an abusive situation if you're talking about a ongoing type of situation. If it's a one-time situation, that might be quite different.
So the notion is that they're always kept at some high level of anxiety because of the ongoing nature of the abusive situation.
Yes.
Now, we tend to think that people get used to bad things, okay?
Yes.
That if you're frightened a lot, you should get used to that and be less frightenable, if you will. Do these models and this research support that theory, or are they, in fact, the opposite?
Well, there can be the adaptation. As I say, they will learn through the trauma learning. They're going to learn how to deal with it. It's not going to be a healthy way, we say, but they certainly they learn to deal with it. And again, you have to look at each situation to see how they do it.
But if I understand what you're saying, basically what the research has shown is that people who have been traumatized frighten more easily than other people.
Oh, yes, they do.
So they don't get used to it in that sense.
Not in that sense, no.
And the coping strategies that children come up with to deal with abuse, such as sexual abuse or other abuse, typically, what are they?
Well, some of the coping mechanisms, the other important one is the fight aspect. You will get children, especially very young children, who will protest in terms of hitting at the abuser or hitting at someone or crying. Crying is another verbal way, if you will, of fighting, so that you will hear symptoms
We've all heard that Eric was a crier. He was always crying.
along that line with very young children. Other symptoms, again, you would look for the age of the child to see where along the continuum there would be symptoms.
I mean, when we talk about fighting, we're all picturing, like, fisticuffs, but you're really talking about is rejecting or efforts to reject the abuse or to...
Yes, we call it protest behaviors, that if you take a careful history, you often can find, again, especially in young children, some manner in which they try to protest it.
And would threats to run away or attempts to run away in an older child constitute protest behavior?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Would hiding in the closet or trying to elude the abuser constitute protest behaviors?
Yes.
Now, I think that you said that this neurobiological model now accepts the notion that there is recoding of the brain on the basis of the exposure to trauma.
Yes.
With a child under, say, the age of 3, has the brain been fully coded, I mean, in its original or baseline form yet?
No, it has not.
So if you have a child under the age of 3 who is subject to traumatic episodes, is the original coding of that child's brain different than it would have been, hypothetically, without the trauma?
Yes.
So can you preset a child from a very early age to be hypersensitive and hyperaroused to fear?
Yes, you can.
Now, turning back for a moment to how this whole system is activated during, say, an abusive episode on a child, yes? This anxiety that this kind of behavior creates, how does this affect in the long term such a child?
Well, it's going to affect various aspects of its development because that's going to be carried into each developmental stage.
And what do you mean by that?
Well, as children develop, there are tasks that must be mastered for them to be able to move on to the next task. And that's generally the way one looks at child development. So when you have the anxiety, that is also going to influence those phases.
Is there some notion that a child coping with this kind of trauma and stress from an early age can't get out of the past somehow?
Yes, that's precisely one of the problems, is their mind continually goes back to the abusive situation.
And how does that interfere with learning?
And that's going to interfere with learning because the mind keeps going back and doesn't push on to present and future. Good mental health generally looks at people who can stay present and future-oriented.
Now, also, I think you said that one of the coping strategies is this notion of dissociating.
Yes.
Or this notion of numbing. Are those the same things, or are they different?
They're really different.
Okay. Why don't you describe? I think you described what dissociating is. It means sending your mind somewhere.
Yeah, that's a more cognitive kind of function, whereas the numbing is much more of a physiological feeling, affect type of phenomenon.
So in a numbing coping response, the child just doesn't feel things physically, or does he not feel things emotionally also?
Yeah, they really are separated from the thought. In other words, they're cut off. Sometimes it's described as somebody's cut off from their feelings.
Now, let's assume you have a child who's in this kind of environment where they're being exposed to these traumas. Do they tend just to dissociate during trauma, or does it become a habit, if you will, of mind?
Yeah, it really can become a habit of mind.
And
Yes.
when you're examining, say, the background of a child, are you looking for evidence of this dissociating outside of the actual abuse incidents?
Yes, I am.
And what do you frequently find?
That you will find a number of reports stating that this is going on. It won't be stated as dissociation, but it will say the child is not necessarily concentrating in school, or seems to be daydreaming a lot, or is looking out the window, or is not able to follow the activities in the classroom.
And that's what this looks like from the outside in a child dissociating?
Yes, this is what another person would generally observe.
Now, this other notion of numbing is, Does the literature support the notion that abused children tend not to relate the incidents with a great deal of emotional affect?
Yes.
Is that related to this notion of numbing?
Yes.
And would you explain that?
Well, they are cut off from the feeling so that when they describe what has happened, they're able to do it. They're able to describe in a rather perfunctory way what has necessarily occurred. And what we say the affect, the emotion, does not necessarily match the statement. And that would sometimes be in the initial stages of an evaluation.
Now, and then ultimately perhaps the children get back in touch and are able to be emotional and...
Well, that's the purpose of treatment.
Okay. Let's talk about, though, this notion of a child who's been through this history. When they're in a new stressful situation, would you tend to find them using these coping strategies, dissociating and numbing?
Yes.
Like if they're testifying in a courtroom in a trial where their life is at stake, would you tend to think they'd rely on old defenses like dissociation and numbing?
Yes.
Objection sustained. The answer is correct.
Is courtroom, the structure of a courtroom and the method of examining a witness, is that something that produces anxiety usually in the people on the witness stand?
Yes.
If those people have a history of being particularly sensitive to stress and pressure, could it cause them to fall back on coping devices from the past?
Yes, it could.
Now, one point, we've talked about this brain recoding, which is an actual change in the genetic structure.
Yes, the transmission of the message.
Can the brain ever be recoded back to normal, do we know?
Well, there are efforts now to begin to attend to this. Whether it gets back, I'm not sure that we have that research, but we do have efforts to influence through medication the brain chemistry.
But short of intervention through medication, the brain doesn't just automatically recode itself if the particular stressful situations stop, for example.
No, but if there's a reduction of the stressful situation, that's a major step forward. That's what you always try to do in any situation, is to eliminate the trauma.
So these people may get better then?
Yes.
And at some point, could their tendency, for example, to be highly anxious and hypervigilant diminish over time?
Yes.
Would that happen even without treatment, or does it require?
It generally requires treatment.
You had said that these were the symptoms that couldn't even be treated with usual talk therapy.
Yes.
Now, you said that there are some adaptions that abused people or traumatized people make so that they can survive in an ongoing way.
Yes.
If something changes, if some new element or new crisis comes in, do those adaptions work?
No, they do not.
And then are these people likely to experience these really extreme fear reactions?
Yes, they are.
Now, going back to this notion of trauma learning, okay, how long does the impact of this last on a child's life?
It can be long-lasting.
Okay, what are some of the impacts that you can see in some of the behavioral or psychological impacts that you can see?
We notice many impacts in terms of you can get what's called the more internalizing type of reactions, where there's withdrawal, there may be depression, there may be serious suicidal thinking. Then you can get what's called more of the externalizing symptoms, where there is more of a showing of the distress in a behavioral way. So you can get schoolroom, classroom kinds of symptoms, acting up, if you will, in a classroom, not being able to sit still. Things in which children's behavior becomes a problem.
Okay. What effect does it have on the child's concept of self?
It is very negative to the child's concept of self. It makes the child feel worthless, helpless. All of those types of negative feelings generally come into play.
Now, this notion of helplessness, is this a notion that runs through examination of traumatized people of various types?
Yes, it does.
There's a term that's usually applied in battered women cases of learned helplessness. Does something similar occur to children?
Yes, you can see a non-assertive. They're not in any way able to defend themselves, so you see a much more passive presentation with children.
Now, apart from this sort of personality projection, does a child who's been in these situations repeatedly where they can't fight and they can't flee, do they approach problem solving the same way as a child who's been able to influence what happens to them, who has had some control?
No, they don't.
Okay, and can you explain the difference?
Well, the problem-solving skills, which are very important cognitive skills, if you will, and certainly all relate to the way information comes in, may well be severely influenced in terms of they just haven't learned them. They've been focusing on other kinds of things so that they may perceive a situation differently. They have not had the experience that other non-traumatized children have.
You understand that in the theoretical framework of, I want to go back for a moment to the battered wife, when the question is posed, why don't battered wives just walk out the door, the theoretical answer is learned helplessness. Are there more than just that reason as to why children don't just walk out the door?
Well, children, yes, there are more reasons why children don't. They may have no place to go. They may have no safety aspect. They certainly may be small that they can't, and they also are very connected with their parents. There are a lot of mitigating factors that a child still believes that the parent is the most important person, and they feel very much connected with the parent.
But is helplessness, this helplessness learning, if you will, or this learning to be helpless, something that continues into adolescence and even young adulthood in abused children?
Yes, if it's not interrupted, yes.
And for those children, even if they're old enough theoretically to walk out the door, does helplessness play a role?
Yes.
And what role does it play?
It keeps them tied into the situation. They don't see their options. They can't think of what else to do. So we do see that phenomenon with adolescents.
Do most abused children run away, or do most abused children stay there and take it? Based on the research in the literature.
Objection sustained to the former question.
Okay. There have been numerous studies, have there not, of abused and molested children?
Yes.
And particularly in the incest and home abuse setting. Okay?
Yes.
To focus on domestic abuse rather than abuse by strangers.
Yes.
And there's statistical studies done in this area as well, are there not?
Yes, there are.
To assess the extent of various forms of child abuse in this country and in this state currently?
Yes.
And do abused and molested children tend to leave the home routinely?
No, they don't.
Now, do people who have had this experiencing and re-experiencing of trauma have a sense, you've talked about helplessness, do they also have a sense of isolation?
Yes, they do.
And what causes that?
Well, the isolation very often is something that's imposed by the abuser to keep the child from persons that they may be able to talk to, so that you do see a family, in the case of a family situation, where the children are kept away from friends, other family members.
Now, when you say kept away, do you have to be totally locked off or, permanently to have a sense of being isolated from other people?
No, it can be from the way that it's stated in the family, the rules of the family, so to speak.
Do children who have experienced trauma learning, in the sense that they have been frightened by an abuser in the family, tend to be easier to control by way of rule setting?
Yes, they do.
Is there a notion in behavioral literature that terror is an effective tool for discipline?
Yes.
And I think you've already indicated that abused children, particularly sexually molested children, tend to be compliant and passive.
Objection.
Rephrase the question.
Yes, I think you've indicated that sexually abused children, for there to be long-term abuse, tend to be passive and compliant.
Yes.
Is that because they like it?
No, it is not.
Do they like it?
No, they do not.
Now, is one of the distinctions between, when we come to these issues of isolation and helplessness and inability to come up with alternatives for their situation, one of the distinctions between children raised in such an environment and battered women, that battered women at least have earlier life experiences
That's correct.
in which they could have problem solved or had responsibility for themselves?
Yes.
Overruled. The answer will stand.
Now, I want to go back for a moment to the actual fear response, okay?
Yes.
The physical signs of this fear response are what?
Increased heart rate, blood pressure increase, sweating, all of the autonomic nervous system symptoms. There are more, but those are the general ones that people feel.
When people describe things like tingling and their scalp, people talk about their hair standing on end and chills running down their spine. Are there actual biological causes for that,
Yes.
linkages?
Yes.
And when a person who has this, you talked about the kindling or rekindling effect on Friday?
Yes, I did.
Would you describe to us what that is?
Well, the kindling effect is where, in a traumatized person, they have a certain level of the fear, so that when the new, they perceive in their environment a new cue, it takes much less for that to flare up, if you will, so that it really explains that higher level of fear response than in non-traumatized persons.
And when these persons are experiencing this trauma response, do they get all the same physical signs and symptoms that anybody else would?
Yes, they do in the situation, yes. Yes.
Now, is there research that indicates that one of the side effects of this alteration in the neurobiological structure is a change in the serotonin levels that the body produces?
Yes.
What is serotonin?
Well, serotonin is an important brain hormone that modulates and regulates and keeps at this even keel, if you will, so that the neurons can transmit back and forth. So it's a very important chemical part of the brain.
And is it believed that people who have undergone these genetic changes due to exposure to trauma have a lower serotonin level than non-traumatized populations?
Yes, they have a lower level.
And you talked about medication as an intervention. Is this one of the areas where they're seeking now to medicate to raise the serotonin level?
Oh, yes, they do. You actually can raise the serotonin level by prescribing certain medicines.
Which medicines are effective in doing that?
There are several by trade name. Prozac is one, Zoloft is one, Wellbutrin is another, I believe.
And are these then the kinds of medications that are now being prescribed for traumatized people to help overcome what this genetic remapping may have done?
Yeah. Well, it's done also for depression and suicidality as well as the traumatized. I mean, there are other populations that benefit from that.
Oh, I know. I think we've all heard about Prozac, but...
Yes.
All right, we have a jury needs a break, so we'll take a recess and we'll resume in 15 minutes. Don't discuss the matter with anyone. Don't form.
And that's where I'm going to stop it for today. We're about halfway through this video, so I'm splitting it up into two parts. Not that it matters to you. This is from the Menendez trials. Here, Menendez trials, part 1. So she was on the stand for 5.5 hours in this one, and then on another video, she's on the stand for like almost 7 hours. So we're splitting it up. So we're not doing a 6-hour stream at a time. So just FYI, we will pick up next time with cross-examination of Dr. Ann Burgess. And it'll be interesting to see because I think they're going to really go hard at her. Ms. Bazanich, most likely, is going to try to debunk psychology as if psychology isn't real. But we know today that it is. Maybe in the 90s, early 90s, we didn't think so, but we know now that it's pretty accurate. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this. I'm really liking Dr. Ann Burgess. I think we need more women out there like her, just, paving the way for others to learn, to actually learn from people and how people process things and how people relate to one another and not just, some statistic. I think it's important to know uh, what these kids were going through and all the chemical changes in their brains that were happening at the time. And it affects their ability to make decisions and to make the decision not to shoot their parents. I mean, it would affect the way that their brains obviously work. And that's why she's here to let the jury understand that. Because until you're in a situation where you're being mistreated by someone else, you don't really know how you're going to react. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Maybe one day I'll get more into my ex-husband and stuff because it relates. Especially I relate to like a lot of the stuff that Dr. Ann Burgess was talking about. So anyways, maybe one day I'll tell you a little bit more, but I don't think today's the day. We don't have time. I got to take care of the dogs. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. Thank you for hitting that like button so that this stream can get pushed out to others. I really appreciate you guys for being here. Let me know what you think of Dr. Ann Burgess and of this trial as a whole and what's going on in your mind about the Menendez brothers trial. Let me know in the comments below. I will see you guys on Thursday. Take care. Bye now.
If you've been impacted by a true crime and would like your story told in your own words, or if you or someone you know has been wrongfully convicted or accused of a crime, please write to crimeincourtchannel@gmail.com and tell us your real true crime encounters. Thanks for watching.